Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I drove out toward Rachel, Nevada on a late August afternoon. It was the kind of heat that made the air look like it was bending, even though the sun was already getting lower. I had a couple of camera bags in the trunk and an old cooler full of melted ice. I told myself it was just another photo trip, but the truth was I wanted to get as close to the border of Area 51 as I could without doing anything illegal. I'd read about the hills east of Groom Lake, where you could sometimes see weird things in the sky if you were patient. I wasn't expecting UFOs, not really. I just thought it would be interesting to take long exposures of the desert at night, maybe catch some odd military lights or contrails. I parked off a dirt road near Tikaboo Valley right as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The road had a no trespassing sign further down, so I stopped well before that. I hiked up with my tripod and two cameras, my Canon DSLR and an old Nikon film body I still use sometimes. By the time I got to the top of a ridge, the sky had turned purple and the temperature was dropping fast. At first, it was just quiet, that eerie desert quiet where even your own breathing sounds too loud. I set up facing west toward the flat expanse where Groom Lake would be, though you can't actually see the base from there, just endless desert floor. About 45 minutes in, I saw what looked like headlights way off in the distance, not on a road, just out in the middle of the desert. I thought maybe it was an ATV or some off-road vehicle, but the light didn't move like that. It was low, almost hugging the ground, and it didn't throw a beam. It was just glowing. White at first, then it shifted slightly toward orange. I took a few shots with the DSLR, checking the back screen. They showed nothing, just blackness. Even when I set a 30-second exposure, there was no light streak. My Nikon film camera was running with a cable release, shooting longer exposures on its own, so I figured maybe that one would catch it. The light got brighter, then dimmed, like it was pulsing. I kept telling myself it was some sort of military flare or ground test. But then it lifted, slowly, like someone pulling a balloon on an invisible string. Only it went perfectly straight up. No wobble, no sound. I pulled the viewfinder up and tried to focus on it. My camera suddenly locked, not physically, but electronically. The live view froze on one frame. I could still move the body, press buttons, but the screen just showed one still image of the desert no matter what I did. I thought the battery had crashed, so I pulled it, but the same thing happened when I powered it back on. At some point I glanced at my phone. It said 9 for 17. I remember because I had checked the time not long before and it had been just past 8:30. It didn't feel like 45 minutes had passed. I didn't feel tired or like I had zoned out. It was just suddenly later. When I looked back up, the light was gone. The desert was pitch black except for stars. My film camera had stopped shooting too, the shutter cable limp. That freaked me out more than anything. The Nikon is mechanical. It doesn't just quit like that. I packed fast, hands shaking, and hiked back to the car with my flashlight off, half convinced someone was watching me. Every crunch of gravel sounded like footsteps right behind me. At one point I thought I saw movement on the ridge next to mine, just a shadow against a darker background. But when I swung the light over, there was nothing. Back at the car, the cooler water was warm. My dashboard clock read 12:41. I sat there with the engine off, trying to make sense of it. I couldn't remember the hike down. I know I walked it, but the memory was just blank, like I'd skipped it. When I got home 2 days later, I developed the Nikon roll in my bathroom. Out of 36 frames, only one had an image. It was the desert floor, perfectly normal, but there was this faint white blur rising from the center of the frame, almost like smoke, but too solid. Every other frame was completely blank. No scratches, no overexposure, just blank. The Canon still won't take pictures. It powers on, but the live view is frozen, the same way it was out there. The image it shows is the desert ridge, stuck like a painting. I haven't told many people. The couple friends I showed the film photo to just shrugged, said it looked like a processing mistake. Maybe it was. But I know what I saw rising off that desert floor. and I know my camera didn't just decide to freeze on one frame by accident. I still have that Nikon photo. It looks ordinary if you glance at it, just a grainy desert shot, but when you stare long enough, that white blur almost looks like it's moving upward, even though it's just a still image. I keep it in a drawer now. I don't like having it on the wall. That night near Area 51, something happened. I just don't know what. I was stationed at Nellis from 2013 to 2017, but for about a year they rotated me through a site farther north, closer to what most people think of when they hear the base. Officially, I was just a security forces airman pulling perimeter and interior posts. Nothing glamorous. Most of it was sitting in a chair, checking badges, walking slow patrols, and writing hourly logs. The strangest post I ever had was a door in one of the older buildings. On the roster, it was listed as Post 733B. The door itself was plain steel, painted a dull beige like the rest of the hallway, no windows, no keypad, just a placard at eye level that read in block letters, "No entry without escort." That was it. No unit insignia, no room number, no indication what was inside. My orders were always the same: stay seated outside, verify credentials if anyone approached, and log any unusual activity. The thing was, nobody ever approached. Not once in all the months I worked there did I see anyone try to enter or leave. The first few shifts were boring. I sat in a chair across the hall with a binder, jotting down times, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights. The hallway was always cold, colder than the rest of the building, like the air conditioning ran harder there. My reliefs treated it like any other post. They'd trade me the logbook, nod, and walk off. Nobody ever said anything about what the door was for. Then one night around 200, I felt the floor beneath my boots shiver. At first I thought it was an aircraft overhead, but the vibration didn't sound right. It wasn't the heavy thrum you get from jets or helicopters. It was lower, like a metallic hum that started in the walls themselves. My chair rattled slightly. The logbook slid a fraction of an inch across my knee. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. Silence afterward. I looked up and down the corridor, half expecting to see another guard smirking, like maybe they'd wired something to mess with me, but the place was empty. When my relief showed up an hour later, I mentioned it casually. He just shrugged and said, "Yeah, that happens." Noted in the log. No explanation, no curiosity. Like it was routine. After that, I started noticing little things. Sometimes the hum would happen at different hours. Never the same day of the week, but always late at night. Every few weeks, maybe once a month. It always came with that same low vibration that made the air feel thicker, like pressure building. I also started noticing the temperature changes. Right before the vibration, the hallway would get colder. Not by much, maybe a few degrees, but enough that I'd rub my hands together. Once it was so cold I could see a faint cloud when I exhaled, even though the rest of the building was normal. The door itself always looked the same. I checked it each shift, just in case. No scratches on the lock, no smudges on the handle. Dust gathered along the top edge like it hadn't been touched in years. One shift in March, I was sitting there, half dozing, when the hum started again. Stronger than before. The walls actually flexed slightly, like the metal plates inside them were straining. I swear I saw the fluorescent tubes flicker in rhythm with the sound. I stood up, pressing my hand to the wall, and felt it buzzing under my palm. Then it stopped, just like that. Silence so sudden it made my ears ring. I sat back down, heart hammering, and wrote it up in the log exactly as I felt it. 0207, vibration in walls, lights flickered, stronger than usual. The next day, that entry was gone. The page was still there, but the line had been blacked out with thick marker. My handwriting visible under it if you tilted the paper, but officially gone. I asked my supervisor about it. He said, "If something gets redacted, it's not our concern." That was all he gave me. After that, I stopped making detailed notes. Just minor vibration observed or all quiet. I wasn't about to keep handing them material to censor. One night in June, the hum came back, but different. It wasn't steady. It pulsed, like a heartbeat through the floor. I put my ear near the seam of the door, and I swear I heard something else beneath the hum. Not machinery, more like movement. Slow scraping, maybe. a sound I can only compare to metal bending, but drawn out, almost deliberate. I stepped back fast, gun hand twitching, even though I knew drawing down on a steel door would accomplish nothing. When my relief came, I didn't mention it. He gave me a look like he knew I'd heard something anyway. By the end of my rotation, I'd worked that post maybe 24 times. Every time, it felt more wrong. Not just boring, but wrong. Like sitting too close to something you weren't meant to see or hear. I never saw anyone go in or out. No key swipes, no escort logs, just an ordinary hallway with a door that hummed in the middle of the night. On my last week, I took a risk. During the hum, I placed my hand flat against the door itself, not the wall. For a second, it was ice cold, then it jolted hot like touching a stovetop. I yanked my hand back, and in the faint sheen of sweat on the steel, I thought I saw the reflection of my own face, but distorted, stretched like it was being pulled sideways. When I blinked, it was gone. After that, I refused to work 733B again. I swapped shifts with another airman whenever it came up. Nobody argued. I still don't know what was behind that door. All I know is it was never nothing. I was working a short-term contract out in Nevada back in 2016. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly HVAC maintenance and some wiring checks, but the job site was inside Nellis Range, technically under a subcontract tied to the big installation everyone knows by name but nobody talks about. I had been cleared for limited access, nothing deep, just utility corridors, mechanical rooms, and the occasional restricted hallway where they'd have an escort with you. The rules were strict, even for contractors. Every morning, you badge in at the main gate with your escort, badge out at the end of the day, no exceptions. The badge itself is a plain plastic card with your photo, clearance color, and the magnetic strip. Lose it, you're done. They drill that into you day one. I'd been on the job for about 3 weeks without issue. My days were pretty routine. Fix a fan coil here, check refrigerant levels there, write it all down on the clipboard to get escorted back out. Honestly, it was boring, which is why what happened stuck out so much. That day was hot, early August, and I'd been crawling through a duck chase for hours. My shirt was soaked through. Around 6:30 p.m., we wrapped up. I was the last of our little contractor crew still packing up my tools. I remember being tired and a little dehydrated, thinking about the long drive back to Alamo where I was staying. At the final checkpoint, you hand your badge to security, they swipe it, and you're logged out. It's usually the same handful of guards, all serious but not unfriendly. When my turn came, I pulled the badge from my chest lanyard and slid it over. The guard glanced at it, swiped, and then handed it back. Nothing unusual in his expression, except when I clipped it back on, I froze. The face on the card wasn't mine. It was my name, full first and last, spelled right. Same clearance color, same ID number I recognized. But the photo wasn't me. The man in the picture looked maybe 10 years older, darker hair, different bone structure. Not a twin, not even close. I looked up at the guard, expecting him to say something, maybe call me back. He didn't. He was already waving the next guy forward. I stepped aside, staring at the badge like I was losing my mind. I pulled out my phone to check the time, out of instinct, but of course the phone was locked in the locker back at the contractor staging area. They don't allow personal devices past the perimeter. All I had was my tools and this badge that wasn't mine, but also was. I slipped it back into the lanyard and walked out to the parking lot. My legs felt unsteady. I figured maybe there had been some kind of printer glitch earlier, that they'd reissued it by accident, though I knew I hadn't swapped badges with anyone. Nobody else had my name. In the lot, the sun had just gone down and the sky was that dim red-purple over the desert. I climbed into my truck and sat there with the badge in my hand. The photo almost seemed to change in the fading light, like the features blurred the longer I stared. I finally shoved it into the glove box and drove out. On the way back down Highway 375, I kept expecting a call from the contractor office or a security SUV pulling me over. Nothing happened. The badge beeped me through the final external gate like normal. That night, in my motel, I laid the badge on the nightstand and just looked at it. Still my name, still not my face. I thought about showing my crew lead the next morning, but a voice in my head said not to. If they thought I was screwing with the badge system, I'd be booted off site, maybe blacklisted from future work. So I kept my mouth shut. The next morning, I clipped the badge on and walked into the checkpoint like always. The guard scanned it, handed it back without even a glance. No hesitation. I looked at the card again once I was past. The wrong face was still there. For the rest of the week, it stayed that way. No one said a word. None of the guards, none of the escorts, not even the biometric scanner at one of the interior doors. The scanner asked for badge plus palm. I placed my hand and the light went green, like it always did. By the fourth day, I wasn't even sure if I remembered what my original photo looked like. I'd only seen it briefly when the badge was issued. I started to wonder if maybe I'd been mistaken from the start, that maybe it had always been this other man's face. But I knew that wasn't true. I remembered clipping my photo to my shirt, recognizing my own face in the plastic. I was sure of it. The strangest part happened on Friday. I was leaving the main building with my escort, a guy named Reed who never talked much. As we walked out, he glanced at me and said, almost too casually, "Long week, huh?" "Yeah," I answered. Then he added, "You're looking better than your picture, at least." I stopped walking for half a second. He didn't. He just kept going, like he hadn't said anything odd. I thought about asking what he meant, but something in his tone made me swallow the words. That night, when I got back to the motel, the badge was gone. Not misplaced. I checked every pocket, tore apart my truck, flipped the sheets. It just wasn't there anymore. I never reported it. I told the contractor I'd finished my part of the job and asked to be rotated out. They didn't argue. A week later, I was back in Arizona working a refrigeration install, and nobody mentioned Nevada again. I still think about that badge, the other face, the way security acted like nothing was wrong. Sometimes I wonder if someone else has a badge with my photo on it, wearing my name, walking through doors I was never supposed to see. I was running freight through Nevada in the summer of 2018 when this happened. I'd been an independent hauler for about 10 years by then. Nothing unusual about my routes. Military contracts here and there, private loads, construction equipment, whatever paid. I got a call from a broker I didn't know well offering a run out of Las Vegas to a location near Groom Lake. The pay was too good to turn down, double what the miles should have been. Pickup was at a small warehouse just off I-15, nothing marked on the outside. Inside, 3 guys in plain clothes had me back up to a dock. They loaded 1 crate onto my flatbed. That was it, just 1. It wasn't a normal freight crate. 7 feet long, maybe 4 feet high, steel walls, no stenciling, no hazard symbols, not even a serial number I could see. They bolted it down themselves. The whole time, the men hardly spoke, except to remind me to stay on my assigned route and not stop. When I asked about weight for my manifest, one of them just said, "Don't worry, we logged it already." I put my hand on it when I checked the straps. It didn't feel heavy. Actually, it didn't feel like anything was inside. Hollow, like an empty drum. The whole drive north on 93 and then east on 375, I kept thinking about that crate. If it was empty, why would anyone pay so much to move it? The flatbed hardly rode any lower than when I was empty, which confirmed it wasn't weighted. By the time I got close to Rachel, the sun had dropped and the desert air had cooled off. That stretch is lonely. You pass a gas station, then nothing for miles except scrub and dark ridges. I saw maybe 2 cars the whole way. About 20 minutes from the base checkpoint, I pulled over at one of those wide gravel shoulders to stretch my legs. I know I wasn't supposed to, but I'd been sitting for hours and my knees were locking up. I walked around the truck, checking the straps. The crate sat there in the red glow of my taillights, perfectly still. But as I got closer, I noticed something that made me stop. The steel was damp, not condensation, because the air was bone dry. More like the crate itself was sweating, little beads of moisture forming along the seams. I touched it. The metal felt colder than the night air, almost like ice. I climbed back into the cab quick and kept driving. At the outer checkpoint, guards in full gear flagged me down. They didn't wave me through like normal deliveries. They had me cut the engine, step out, and stand 20 feet away while they worked. A team of 6 came out with some kind of rolling lift. They moved slow, deliberate, like they were handling explosives. One guard kept his rifle pointed in my general direction the whole time, not aggressive, just steady. Another two used flashlights to check every strap before cutting them loose. I watched them lower the crate. Nobody talked above a whisper. One of the men motioned with his hand like he was calming someone, even though the crate wasn't moving on its own. They set it on the lift, locked it in, and rolled it off into the darkness beyond the floodlights. When they were done, one guard came back and handed me my paperwork, already signed. He didn't ask me to verify anything, didn't even look me in the eye, just said, "You're good, return south." I got back in my truck and started the engine. My windshield had fogged while I was standing out there, even though the night was dry and cool. It took a minute for the defroster to clear it. As I pulled away, I glanced in the side mirror. For a second, I thought I saw the crate's outline shifting against the floodlights, like the steel was bending inward. Then the lift rolled it out of sight. On the way back through Rachel, I stopped for fuel. The attendant, an older guy with a ball cap, gave me a once-over and asked if I'd been up near the line. I didn't answer. He just nodded like he didn't expect me to. When I parked that night outside of Alamo, I went over the flatbed again. The steel bolts they'd used to anchor the crate were gone, but the metal where they'd sat was scorched. Little rings of black like burn marks. I kept that truck another 3 years. Those marks never faded, no matter how many times I sanded and repainted the bed. I was stationed at a site near Groom Lake in 2011, working as a junior radar tech. Nothing glamorous. Most of my shifts were spent in a dimly lit control room with 2 other guys, watching screens that hardly ever changed. We monitored air traffic around the ranges, logged activity, checked for anomalies. 90% of the time, it was dull. Training flights, test patterns, calibration runs. You write down the times, keep the data clean, and hand it off at the end of the shift. It was the middle of summer, one of those weeks where the desert heat doesn't really let up, even at night. I was on the midnight shift, which usually meant just staring at a radar scope for hours while sipping bad coffee and trying not to fall asleep. The room had no windows, just the low hum of the equipment and the occasional squawk from a headset if there was traffic. Around 0140, something unusual popped up on my screen. A return registered at the far edge of the runway, like something had just powered up there. At first I thought it was a glitch, maybe a reflection or bad data, but the track was solid, not flickering like noise. It looked exactly like an aircraft preparing for takeoff. I marked it in the log, like I was supposed to. New contact, runway origin, holding position. Nothing odd yet, but I remember leaning closer, frowning at the scope. The altitude read 0, the speed almost nothing, but the return was sharp. Then, in a blink, the blip shot forward. The system updated so fast it almost smeared across the display. The acceleration wasn't gradual, it went from stationary to hundreds of knots instantly. Within 2 sweeps of the radar, it had cleared the base perimeter. By the 3rd sweep, it was off the scale. I stared at the numbers. The speed readout climbed past Mach 3, then Mach 6, then it stopped showing anything useful. The system just dumped dashes, like it couldn't calculate anymore. I called over to Jim, another tech who'd been there longer than me. "Hey, you seeing this?" He rolled his chair over, squinting at my scope. For a second, his mouth opened like he was going to say something. Then he leaned back, rubbed his face, and muttered, "Don't." He turned away without another word and went back to his own console. I sat there, heart hammering, watching the blip streak off into nothing. The track line stretched to the edge of the display and vanished. I wrote it down anyway. 0143, unknown departure, impossible acceleration. I underlined it because my brain couldn't process what I'd just seen. Less than a minute later, the entry blinked off my log, just gone. The line I'd typed was replaced with an empty row, like it had never existed. I tried re-entering it, but the system wouldn't let me. The cursor just refused to move onto that time slot. I checked the backup console, same thing. Clean logs, no trace of what I'd just watched. Before I could say anything, the supervisor came in. It was unusual for him to check in that late, but there he was, coffee cup in hand, expression flat. He walked straight over to me, looked at my screen, then at me. "You didn't see anything," he said. His voice wasn't threatening, but it was final. I tried to say something, Due. It logged a takeoff, sir, but he cut me off. No, it didn't. Don't put it in writing again. Don't talk about it again. Clear? I nodded. My mouth was dry. He stared at me another moment, then walked out like it was just another routine check. The rest of the shift crawled by. I couldn't stop glancing at the runway on the scope, half expecting something else to appear. Nothing did. By the time morning came, I felt like I dreamed the whole thing. But when I left the building, I noticed something strange. The air outside smelled faintly metallic, almost like ozone after a lightning strike, even though the sky was perfectly clear. The guards at the gate were quieter than usual too, faces unreadable behind their sunglasses, like they were waiting for something. That day, I went back to my quarters and lay on the bunk for hours, replaying it in my head. A craft leaving the runway, accelerating faster than anything I'd ever heard of, then vanishing from the radar in seconds. Logs auto-cleared. Supervisor shutting it down immediately. I worked there another 7 months. Nothing like that ever showed on my screen again. But I also never stopped thinking about how quick my supervisor had been to appear. Like he already knew what had happened before I even called it out. When my contract was up, I left Nevada and never reapplied. I told myself it was just a glitch, a bad read. But I know what I saw on that scope, and I know I didn't imagine the way the data disappeared right in front of me. I was working as a contractor out at the range in Nevada in 2009. Not directly on the Groom Lake side, but close enough that you knew where the restricted lines were drawn. My job wasn't anything exciting. I was a diesel mechanic, mostly servicing generators, transport trucks, and the occasional oddball piece of equipment the Air Force had dragged out there. You didn't ask questions about the gear you worked on. You just made sure it ran. It was late July, hot enough during the day to burn your skin just walking between the shops, but at night, the desert cooled quick. A couple of us, me, a guy named Wilson, and a younger kid named Harper, were on the evening shift. We'd been repairing a mobile generator that had thrown a belt earlier in the week. Around 10:30, we took a smoke break outside the hangar bay doors. From where we were standing, you could see the long stretch of desert that led to one of the fenced perimeters. Past that fence, it was just nothing. Flat sand, rocks, a few low hills way out in the dark. There wasn't supposed to be anyone out there. The patrols swept it constantly. That's when Harper pointed and said, "Do you see that?" I looked where he was pointing. At first, I thought it was a trick of the heat haze, but there was definitely someone walking out there. A man moving slowly across the sand, barefoot from the look of it. His arms hung loose at his sides, his head slightly down. He was maybe half a mile out, right in the middle of the restricted zone. Wilson swore under his breath. No way. Nobody's supposed to be out there. The guy was walking steady, like he wasn't lost, just headed somewhere. No flashlight, no gear, no vehicle nearby. Just a pale figure in the floodlight glow that reached out farther than you'd think. Harper started toward the radio shack, but before he even got there, the patrol jeeps came rolling up from the south fence line. They must have already seen him on one of the cameras. 2 trucks pulled up fast, their spotlights swinging over the desert. The man didn't react. He just kept walking, slow and barefoot. The patrols circled in, maybe 50 yards out, and I remember the lights hitting him full on. That's when I realized something wasn't right. He didn't throw up a hand, didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge the jeeps at all. Just kept pacing along like he was following something we couldn't see. I expected the guards to jump out and tackle him, but instead they stopped short. One of the jeeps angled so its lights tracked across the sand in front of him. And that's when Wilson let out this sharp little laugh, like he didn't believe what he was seeing. There were footprints, clear as day in the beam of the light, but the sand under each print was darker, almost black, and it caught the light in this strange way, like glass does when it's cracked. It looked melted. The man walked right past the lights, leaving behind this trail of warped footprints that gleamed faintly as the jeeps tracked him. Then, just as he reached a small rise in the sand, he was gone. I don't mean he ducked or ran. One step he was there, the next he wasn't. The patrols lit up the area, swung their beams back and forth, drove circles around the rise. Nothing. Just empty desert. We stood there in silence. Even Harper, who was usually a loudmouth, didn't say a thing. The patrols eventually shut down their lights, lingered for a few minutes, then drove off without a word to us. They didn't radio in, didn't stop to question anyone. It was like whatever had just happened wasn't supposed to be discussed. The next morning, Wilson and I went back out under the excuse of checking the generator fuel levels. Harper refused to come with us, said he was too tired, but I think he just didn't want to see it again. We walked out to where we'd seen the man. The footprints were still there, black, sunken impressions in the sand, maybe 20 of them, all in a line. I crouched down to touch one, and it was hard. Not like sand at all, but fused together, brittle and sharp around the edges. "Glass," Wilson muttered. He kicked a chunk loose, and it broke with a sound like snapping ceramic. The inside was shiny, almost like obsidian. When we came back after lunch, the prints were gone. Not covered up. Gone. The sand looked normal again, like it had never been disturbed. That night, none of us brought it up. Not even Harper. We just finished the shift, went back to our bunks, and acted like it hadn't happened. But for weeks after, I noticed patrols running tighter sweeps around that stretch of desert. Sometimes extra vehicles would head out there right at dusk and sit with their lights off for hours. I never saw the barefoot man again. But I can still picture the way he moved across that sand. Slow, steady, like he didn't even notice the jeeps around him, and the trail of melted prints that vanished as quickly as he did. I was working as an electrical engineer at the Nevada Test and Training Range in 2013. I wasn't military, just a civilian contractor. My job was simple enough most of the time: wiring, troubleshooting generators, replacing panels in aging facilities. The kind of work nobody really notices until something goes wrong. One afternoon, around 5, my supervisor, a guy named Diaz, came by my shop and handed me a short work order. He didn't explain much, just said, "Wiring issue in hangar N19. They want it fixed tonight." I had never heard of N19. I'd been there for 2 years, and by that point I knew the layout of every maintenance hangar in my sector. When I pulled up the digital map, there was nothing labeled N19. I figured maybe it was a typo or a new designation I hadn't caught up with. "Where's that supposed to be?" I asked. Diaz just pointed at a printed slip of paper that had crude directions drawn on it. No GPS coordinates, no official notes. "Follow that," he said. "Don't ask questions." It was odd, but you didn't push back on these things. If something was classified, you weren't going to get an explanation no matter how many questions you asked. I drove out in one of the service trucks following the hand-drawn map. The sun was just dropping behind the hills, and the desert heat was fading into a cold wind. The directions took me farther south than I'd ever gone, past a row of weather-beaten storage sheds, and then down a service road I didn't even know existed. At the end of the road was a tall chain-link gate with no signage. A single airman stood there, rifle slung across his chest. He didn't speak when I pulled up, just scanned my badge, looked at the slip of paper, and waved me through. Past the gate was a wide stretch of asphalt with a single structure on it, a hangar, gray, windowless, with no markings. It looked newer than the other buildings on base, like it had been poured and sealed in the last few years. There were 2 more guards at the hangar doors. They didn't check my truck or my tools. They just told me, "Go straight in. Don't touch anything except the panel." Inside, the air felt colder, almost refrigerated. The hangar was dim except for a cluster of industrial lights shining down on the center of the floor. That's when I saw it. It was a craft, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. Sleek, black, no visible seams or rivets. It wasn't sitting on the floor, wasn't on jacks, wasn't suspended by cables. It hovered maybe 3 or 4 inches above the concrete, completely still, but with this faint vibration in the air around it. I can't really describe the shape. It wasn't a plane, wasn't a helicopter. The closest comparison would be a teardrop, stretched out and flattened, maybe 30 feet long. The surface wasn't shiny, but it caught the light in strange ways, almost like water. My throat went dry. I wasn't supposed to be seeing this. One of the guards cleared his throat behind me and said, "Panels on the east wall. Get it done." I forced myself to turn away from the thing and focus on my job. On the far wall, a breaker cabinet hung open, wires spilling out. Half the circuits were dead, the other half humming irregularly. It looked like someone had tried to reroute power but hadn't finished the job. I set my tools down and got to work. My hands were steady, but I could feel that vibration behind me. It wasn't sound exactly. It was in my chest, like standing too close to heavy machinery. Every so often, the lights above flickered, and when they did, I swore I saw the craft shiver, like a muscle twitching. At one point, I dropped a screwdriver. It clattered across the floor and slid slightly toward the thing like it had been pulled by a weak magnet. I froze. The guards didn't move. I got the wiring sorted after about 40 minutes, replaced a fried breaker, tightened some grounds, rebalanced the loads. When I powered the circuits back up, the hum in the hangar deepened for a moment. The craft seemed to brighten, its surface pulsing once, then going still again. "Done," I said, my voice rough. The guard closest to me stepped forward. "Pack up." I gathered my tools quickly. I wanted out of that building more than anything. On the way to the door, I glanced back one last time. The craft was hovering exactly as before, but I noticed something I hadn't seen when I came in. Along the floor, just beneath where it floated, the concrete was discolored in a perfect oval, darker than the rest, as if the material had been scorched or compressed. The guards walked me out without another word. One of them locked the hangar behind us with a keypad I didn't recognize. At the gate, the airman checked my badge again, then held out his hand. "Paper," he said. I gave him the slip of directions Diaz had drawn. He folded it once and tucked it into his vest pocket. When I got back to the shop, Diaz didn't ask how it went. He just nodded and said, "Good. You're clear." Then he handed me a new work order for a generator on the north side, like nothing unusual had happened. The next day I checked the digital map again. No N19. No road leading out there, no record of a hangar in that spot. When I asked another contractor if he'd heard of it, he shook his head. I didn't press, but I still remember that vibration in my chest, like standing next to something alive, even though it never moved. And I remember the way my screwdriver slid toward it across the floor, as if it wanted to be closer. I worked security at the Nevada Test and Training Range for a little over 4 years, most of it at the main perimeter gates. Most nights were boring, checking credentials, logging vehicles, making sure no one wandered where they didn't belong. My shift usually ran from 6 in the evening to 6 in the morning, 12 hours sitting in that booth with a thermos of coffee and the occasional convoy rolling through. One night in February 2017, I was assigned to the South Gate. Cold, windy, moonless. The kind of night where you're grateful for the little space heater under the desk. Nothing unusual happened during the shift. 2 deliveries around midnight, a contractor who'd left his badge in the barracks and had to wait while his supervisor vouched for him, and one of the patrol units swinging by for a quick check-in around 3. When 6 rolled around, I powered down the terminal, locked the booth, and clocked out just like always. The system showed my badge out, meaning I'd officially left. I remember the scanner light turning green. I drove home, which was about 45 minutes away in Alamo. Roads were empty. I stopped at the Sinclair on Highway 93 for gas, grabbed a stale breakfast burrito, and pulled into my driveway just after 7. When I walked inside, my wife, Carla, was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She looked up at me and frowned. "Where are you going?" she asked. I was still in uniform, badge clipped to my chest. "Home," I said. "Shift's over." She stared at me like I was joking. "You already came home, last night. You got in around 7 like always, climbed into bed, and you were snoring before I even finished brushing my teeth." I laughed because I thought she was pulling one on me, but she didn't laugh back. She looked pale, confused. "Carla," I said, "I've been at the gate all night. I just walked in the door." She shook her head slowly. "No, you were here. I felt you get in bed. You woke up around 9, said you couldn't sleep, and went to watch TV in the living room. I even saw you sitting on the couch." I didn't know what to say. My uniform pants still smelled faintly of the booth heater, that metallic dust smell. The burrito wrapper was in my truck, but she was dead serious. I went into the bedroom. The sheets on my side were messy, like someone had been lying there. My pillow had that dent in it, like when you've had your head down for hours. Carla hadn't touched it. I tried to brush it off, Maybe she'd dreamed it. Maybe she'd been half asleep and imagined me there. But she was certain. She even described me tossing the covers off when I got too hot, exactly the way I always do. Later that day, I logged into the security portal from my work laptop just to double check. My badge history showed continuous activity at the Southgate booth from 6:03 p.m. to 6:01 a.m. No interruptions, no duplicate scans. According to the system, I never left. I didn't mention it to anyone at work. Not Diaz, not the other guards. Things like that, you don't bring them up. You don't want to end up in some office answering questions. But that night, when I went back on shift, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The booth looked the same as always, but I kept catching myself glancing at the chair, half expecting to see me sitting there. Around midnight, I stepped outside to stretch my legs. The desert was pitch black except for the faint glow from the lights above the gate. No wind, no sound, just dead still. I got this crawling feeling like someone was watching me. I scanned the fence line, the access road, the desert beyond. Nothing. When I went back inside, I checked the terminal again. My badge log showed me scanning out at 6:01 a.m. the previous morning, exactly when I remembered leaving. But there was another entry. Same badge number, same name. It showed me scanning back in at 7:12 a.m., the exact time Carla swore she'd seen me at home. The log had no workstation attached, no location code, just access granted. I stared at it until my shift partner, a guy named Morales, came by on patrol and asked if I was okay. I just closed the window and said, yeah. When I got home the next morning, Carla didn't say anything. She just gave me this strange look when I walked in, like she wasn't sure which version of me she was seeing. The sheets on my side of the bed were messy again. She swore she hadn't touched them. I was working nights at one of the communications outposts near Groom Lake back in the fall of 2015. I wasn't military, just a contractor handling the audio logs, recording channels, keeping tapes and digital files organized, that sort of thing. Most nights were dull, long stretches of nothing punctuated by routine check-ins or test signals. I didn't mind. The pay was good and the work was quiet. It was a cold, windy evening, just after sunset. The desert air had that sharp, dry bite that gets under your skin when the sun drops behind the hills. I was alone in the comms room, except for the occasional passing guard checking in. The building had no windows, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and the faint hum of the equipment running constantly. Around 10:15, I was scanning the incoming audio channels, making sure nothing had scrambled during the last round of tests. Most of it was static or normal radio chatter. That's when I heard it, my name. It wasn't in a clear voice exactly, more like a distorted signal looping through the static. Nathan, Nathan. It repeated over and over, low and fractured, as if the transmission was struggling to maintain itself. I froze, my hand on the tape player. The channel was supposed to be inactive, just a feed from a long-range sensor array. Nothing human was supposed to be broadcasting on it. Hello? I said into the room, though no one would answer. My voice sounded strange, muffled, swallowed up by the hum of the machines. The name kept repeating for maybe 20 seconds, broken, skipping like a scratched record. Then it stopped, leaving only the low static hum in the speakers. I rewound the tape and played it again. The moment it reached the point where I'd heard my name, it was gone. Just static. I thought I'd misheard. Maybe fatigue, maybe my brain filling in words. But then it happened again a few minutes later on a different channel. Same distorted voice, same repetition of my name. I jotted it down on the log, trying to stay calm. Possible signal interference. Here repetition of name, unknown source. I didn't mention it to anyone. You didn't bring these things up if you wanted to keep your job. I replayed the tape later that night in the quiet of the comms room, headphones on. I expected the same fragmented, haunting voice calling my name. But the section that had triggered me earlier was clean. No voice, no distortion. Just normal background static. I checked the other channels. Nothing. Not even a trace of what I'd heard live. My log still had the note from the first recording, but it was useless. I compared timestamps, ran a diagnostic on the equipment. Nothing malfunctioned. For the next few nights, I tried to recreate it. Sitting at the same console, scanning the same channels, adjusting levels, everything I could think of. Never happened again. Not on the original tape, not live, not anywhere else. But the feeling didn't leave me. Every time I walked down the hall toward the sleeping quarters, I had this tight, cold sensation in my chest, like someone was listening behind me. I'd glance at the security cameras, see the long, empty corridors, the same flickering fluorescent lights, and still feel it, like a presence lingering just out of view. Once, a week later, I caught a brief glint in one of the cameras. Movement that didn't match anyone I knew was on shift. Just a shadow, pale and flickering along the wall of the comms hallway. By the time I swiveled the monitor, it was gone. No reflection, no person, just the empty corridor. I tried talking to the other contractors subtly, mentioned odd glitches in the recordings, interference, hearing your name in static. They nodded, distracted, didn't ask questions. You could tell they didn't want to talk about it. You learned quickly not to press. I kept my hours, finished out my contract. Nothing else ever came through those channels. Nothing that sounded like a voice, a name, anything unusual. But I knew what I'd heard. There's a line between what the tape shows and what you experience when you're alone, in the quiet, with the desert wind carrying through vents and the low hum of electronics in your ears. Even now, years later, sometimes when I'm alone and hear a scratchy sound in a static-laced channel, I swear I can hear it. My name, just barely, buried under noise I can't explain. But when I try to catch it, replay it, record it, it's gone. Just gone. I never spoke to anyone about it outside that post. Not a single supervisor, not a friend, no one. Some things you don't report because there's nothing to report, nothing to prove, and everything to lose if they take it seriously. I left Nevada not long after that assignment ended. I moved back east, got a different line of work. But every time I think about comms nights, the empty halls, the hum, I remember it. The voice repeating my name, clear in the moment, gone when I tried to hold it. And I don't know why. I still don't. I was flying a small Cessna 182 out of Tonopah Airport in the fall of 2016. It was one of those late afternoon flights, dry, hot, sun low over the desert, visibility perfect. I'd been doing private pilot hours for years, mostly short cross-country trips to practice navigation and night flying. That evening, I had planned a loop over the Nevada Test and Training Range, just south of Groom Lake. Nothing fancy, just me, the plane, and the desert below. I climbed out around 5:30 p.m., cleared the local airspace, and started tracking south. The wind was calm, the engine hummed steadily, and the controls felt tight, as they always did. From that altitude, you could see miles and miles of scrub desert, small washes cutting through it, and the distant ridges rolling into the horizon. About 20 minutes in, near a restricted sector marked on the sectional chart as controlled airspace, I noticed a light off my right wing. It was small, bright, and steady. I assumed it was a reflection at first, maybe from my cockpit canopy, but it didn't move with me. I turned slightly to get a better look. The light moved. Not in a predictable aircraft pattern, it paced me, holding roughly the same distance off my wing, shifting slightly up and down, almost like it was adjusting. I checked the radio. Nothing unusual on nearby ATC frequencies, no other traffic on the scope. I called into the FAA flight service, Tonopah traffic, Cessna 182, 5 miles south of Groom Lake, visual contact with unidentified traffic, requesting advisories. The operator came back instantly, calm and professional. Cessna 182, negative traffic, maintain VFR, proceed as filed. The light stayed. It didn't have navigation lights, no strobes, nothing that made sense for a normal aircraft. I tried a gentle turn to see if it followed, like it was mimicking my movements. It did. Bank left, it banks left. Climb, it climbs. Drop altitude, same thing. I started logging my position and the time on the kneeboard. 10:54, 17:57, 18:01. Each entry, the light was still there, pacing. It wasn't close enough to be dangerous, but it wasn't far enough to ignore. About 10 minutes later, I heard a faint static burst over the radio, like someone was trying to break through a channel. It was quiet, intermittent, almost garbled, but I thought I could make out a voice saying, "Roger, 182." I tried responding, asking if anyone else was seeing the traffic. The static cut out. At that point, I realized I had no way of knowing what it was. No one else reported it, and the FAA controller was treating it like nothing was there. I started circling gently, keeping visual contact while trying not to panic. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, the light seemed to adjust, moving closer to the plane's altitude and speed, almost like it was calibrating itself. My shadow stretched across the desert below, and for a brief moment I had the sense I was being observed from the ground too, like someone was tracking our flight path. By the time I approached the westbound leg back toward Tonopah, the light vanished. 1 second it was pacing me, the next, nothing. No fading, no streak, no flash, just gone. I checked all instruments, my own heading and position. Nothing wrong with the plane. When I landed, I filled out the normal flight log and noted the unusual encounter. I also called the FAA later that evening to make an official report, detailing the pacing light, my times, altitudes, positions, and the faint static transmission I thought I heard. A week later, I called to follow up. The FAA officer on the line was polite but firm. "Sir, we have no record of any report filed by a Cessna 182 on that date. Your call wasn't logged, and no unusual traffic was reported by radar or other pilots." I double-checked my own notes and even pulled screenshots from the GPS logger in the cockpit. All my personal records matched exactly what I'd submitted. The positions, the times. But according to the FAA, none of it existed. My call never happened. The flight was routine, and no lights or traffic were observed. I asked them if there was some administrative error, maybe a delayed log entry or a system glitch. They just repeated that there was no incident and I wasn't to worry about it. Over the next few months, I flew that route a handful of times at similar altitudes and times of day. Nothing ever happened again. No lights, no voices, nothing unusual. I stopped mentioning it at all. Even my logbooks didn't help. The personal GPS data didn't count as official proof. The whole thing started to feel like a weird memory, something I couldn't share without sounding insane. But I can still see it when I close my eyes. The way the light moved perfectly with the plane, adjusting in real time, the way the desert looked as the sun set behind the ridges, the faint feeling that someone or something was tracking me from the ground at the same time. I flew commercially for a couple years after that, but I never flew that sector alone at sunset again. The FAA records may not show anything, but I know what I saw, what I felt, and the way it followed me for that stretch of desert sky. Even now, years later, I still check my logs when I fly anywhere near Nevada. I know the numbers will match my experience, but the official channels never will. And part of me wonders if anyone else ever saw that light, or if I was simply the only one who did. I was working as a field tech for a small aerospace contractor in 2014. Most of my job involved maintaining sensors, repairing damaged test equipment, and occasionally doing post-incident cleanup. Nothing glamorous. I was used to long hours in the desert, sunburned neck, dusty boots, and the constant wind cutting across the flat washes. One afternoon in late October, a small aircraft classified test project, nobody outside the contractor or military teams knew the details, crashed a few miles outside the southern boundary of the Nevada Test and Training Range. The crash wasn't fatal. The pilot walked away with minor injuries. My team was dispatched to help recover debris and clear the site for investigation. It was hot and dry, around 87 degrees when I arrived, and the smell of burnt composite hung in the air. I spent the first hour cataloging fragments, taking photos, and logging serial numbers for all the parts. Most of it was twisted aluminum and shattered panels, but a few pieces were intact, covered in a thin layer of soot. While the team was distracted, one guy measuring wing fragments, another bagging wiring, I noticed a small piece of scrap about the size of a smartphone tucked in the sand at the edge of the crater. It was smooth, metallic, darker than the surrounding wreckage, and oddly uniform, like it had been machined rather than broken. I picked it up. It was unnaturally cold, almost biting to the touch. I brushed off some sand, feeling the cold travel up my fingers. I knew better than to carry debris without logging it, but something about that little piece drew me in. It was heavy, solid, and unlike anything I'd seen before. I slipped it into my cargo pocket. The rest of the day went on normally. We collected what we could, secured the site, and were cleared to leave by the on-site officer. I drove back to my motel in Alamo, keeping the piece in my pocket all the way. The cold didn't fade, it was almost persistent, like it had its own temperature. That night, in my room, I put the piece in the top drawer of the small desk. I left it alone, just sat on the bed staring at the desert through the small window. I fell asleep around 11:30, exhausted, the scrap still cold in my drawer. When I woke around 6:15 a.m., the piece was gone. The drawer was empty. On top of the desk, where nothing had been the night before, was a small note, folded neatly. I unfolded it. In simple handwriting, it read, "Don't take what isn't yours." I blinked a few times, thinking I was dreaming. I looked under the bed, in my suitcase, even the trash can. Nothing. The note was the only thing left. My first thought was someone had entered the room, but the lock on the door was intact. The motel security camera facing the hallway didn't show anyone entering. The staff confirmed no one had been there. I shoved the note back into the drawer, hoping that would be the end of it. I felt uneasy, but told myself it was just a prank, or my imagination after a long day. Later that morning, I tried to call my supervisor to explain. When I described the scrap piece, the same smooth metal, the same cold, he got quiet and said, "Nathan, make sure you didn't pocket anything you weren't supposed to. The site's heavily monitored and there's nothing missing officially. Don't mention it again." Over the next few days, I kept my mind on the usual routine, checking sensor lines, repairing damaged conduits, filing reports, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching. Not actively, but present. While walking across the open desert to inspect remote sensors, I'd catch a shadow at the edge of my vision. It would disappear when I looked directly. Even at night, in the motel, the air in the room sometimes felt different, heavier, colder near the drawer where the scrap had been. I avoided it, didn't open the top drawer, and I didn't sleep well. I asked a couple of fellow techs if they ever experienced anything odd at crash sites, or if they'd noticed things disappearing. They laughed it off. Desert heat, stress, long hours, they said, but I could tell by the way they looked at each other they weren't entirely dismissive. Weeks later, I returned to the crash site for follow-up checks. Nothing had changed, except a faint indentation in the sand where I had originally found the scrap. It was perfectly oval, maybe 6 inches across, the sand slightly fused at the edges. I kicked at it. It crumbled like normal dirt, but the impression remained, subtle and unnatural. I never found out what happened to the piece. No one ever mentioned it. No one came to recover it. I never tried to take anything again. The note stayed in my mind for months, folded and tucked in a notebook I carried for logs and sketches. Even now, when I think about it, I can feel the cold from that scrap metal, the way it seemed almost aware, like it didn't belong to this world, or at least not to me. And that note, the handwriting, the exact words. I don't know who left it or why. I never told anyone outside a handful of people I trusted. Talking about it meant sounding insane. But the desert, the crash site, the memory of that cold scrap, and the warning stayed with me long after I stopped working near Groom Lake. Sometimes when I open a drawer, I half expect it to be there again, lying in the same spot. The cold would be the first thing I'd feel, and I know I'd leave it there. The wind was gusting across the desert when I got to the south perimeter of the base that night. It was mid-March 2018, and even though the days were warming up, nights still carried that sharp, dry chill that creeps under your jacket. I'd been working the night shift for almost a year by then, doing maintenance and monitoring equipment near the fences. Most nights were quiet, sometimes too quiet, but this was something else. I was sitting in the little portable shack with my partner Luis, logging sensor readings when it started. Faint at first, like someone calling out from far away, barely audible over the wind. I tilted my head. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Luis paused, pencil midair over the log sheet. "Hear what?" "That screaming?" "Or something like it, out there." I pointed toward the flat expanse of desert beyond the chain link fence. He frowned, squinting into the darkness. "Could be coyotes." I shook my head. "No, coyotes don't sound like that. It's human." We sat quietly for a moment, straining to hear. The wind shifted and the sound came again. Higher pitched, wavering, fading in and out, carried on the desert gusts. It wasn't constant, more like bursts, sometimes overlapping, almost echoing across the empty terrain. Luis finally grabbed the radio. Dispatch, this is Patrol Unit 3. We think we're hearing something outside the perimeter, possibly on the east side. Can we get a sweep? Unit 3, proceed with caution. Copy. ETA for reinforcements 5 minutes, came the calm, clipped reply. By the time the other patrol arrived, the sound had stopped. We fanned out along the fence line, flashlights cutting across the dark brush and uneven washes. Nothing. No tracks, no footprints, no evidence of anyone being out there. The desert was untouched except for our own footprints in the sand. I checked the motion sensors along the fence. All clear. Thermal cams. Nothing. Not a single warm body. And yet that screaming, that sound of someone calling, had been real. I hadn't imagined it. Luis agreed. We stayed out there for another hour, walking slow, circling, trying to find the source. Every now and then the wind carried faint echoes, soft enough that you almost convinced yourself it was nothing. But then it would rise again, like someone right on the edge of hearing, just beyond the fence. By the time we returned to the shack, the air had cooled sharply. I leaned against the wall, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. Luis just lit a cigarette, puffing quietly. Neither of us spoke for a while. Over the next few nights, the same thing happened. Around 1 a.m., sometimes 2, faint screams riding the desert wind. Always coming from outside the perimeter, always impossible to locate. Patrols would search, sweep, run thermal cams, check motion sensors. Nothing. The recordings we kept on the comms channels never picked it up, at least not clearly. Just static with occasional brief peaks that sounded like voices, distorted and fleeting. One night, I stayed longer, sitting outside the shack with my back to the wind, watching the ridges in the distance. I started noticing movement, or what I thought was movement, at the edge of my peripheral vision. Shadows shifting across the desert floor, but when I turned, nothing. Just sand, rocks, and low scrub. I began keeping a personal log, noting wind direction, temperature, approximate time, anything I thought might correlate with the sound. No pattern emerged. Sometimes it was calm, other nights gusting hard, sometimes coming from the north, sometimes from the south. Always fleeting, always gone before you could pin it down. Luis quit a few months after that. He said he couldn't handle the tension, the constant sense of being watched, the way the sound would seem to follow him. I didn't blame him. Even now, when I think about it, I get that same uneasy pull in my chest, remembering how impossible it was to feel safe when the screams came, even inside the shack. The base higher-ups never mentioned it officially. There were whispers, brief conversations in hushed tones, but nothing concrete. Some of the newer patrols joked about hearing the ghost screams, but we all knew better. It wasn't a joke. I left that post eventually, moved back closer to Vegas. I still hear it sometimes in my dreams, the thin, wavering sound of someone calling, lost in the wind. And even now, years later, when I drive out on a deserted desert highway at night and the wind picks up, I glance toward the empty ridges, half expecting to hear that same faint voice carried across the open sand. Nothing follows me. Nothing chases me. But the memory of it, the strangeness of hearing something that shouldn't be there, the knowledge that patrols found nothing, stays. And I don't know what it was. I only know that it happened over and over and that it could vanish so completely that official records, sensors, and cameras never noticed a thing. I was contracted to do some wiring upgrades at the southern end of the Nevada Test and Training Range in 2016. Most of my work was straightforward: run cables, check power circuits, verify sensors. Nothing glamorous, and most of the time you were alone, wandering between fenced-off buildings with little to do but check gauges and note voltages. That night, I arrived late, around 11 p.m., after a 2-hour drive from Las Vegas. The base was quieter than usual. The wind had picked up, kicking dust across the road, and the lights along the perimeter fence flickered in the gusts. My supervisor at the gate gave me the usual nod and told me to wait while they processed my clearance. They led me to a small holding area tucked behind one of the administrative hangars. The room had mirrored walls, floor to ceiling. I assumed it was for security monitoring, seeing everyone in the space from multiple angles, or maybe just some weird psychological test for visitors. I waited, leaning against the wall, trying to get comfortable on the cold linoleum floor. That's when I noticed it. My reflection. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks. I raised my hand and the reflection followed. I blinked, and the reflection blinked. I breathed in, and my reflection remained still. I froze. Slowly, I exhaled. The mirrored version still didn't move. I stared for a few moments, unsure if I was hallucinating or if the lighting was just messing with my perception. But the mirrored image didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't mimic a single motion, except when I moved my limbs slowly. Every blink, every subtle nod, every tilt of my head, half of it matched, half of it was wrong. A loud click from the door snapped me out of it. A security officer opened the way to the next area. Your clearance is approved. Follow me. I stepped toward the exit, glancing back at the mirrored walls. For a fraction of a second, I saw the reflection standing there, still, its chest motionless as if frozen mid-frame, unmoving while I walked away. My stomach sank. I shook my head, told myself it was nothing. Tired eyes, stress, maybe the mirrors were angled in a weird way. The next few days, I kept replaying the moment in my head. I drove out to the site at night, alone sometimes, trying to see if the reflection thing would happen again. It never did. None of the other holding rooms had mirrors like that. No one else ever mentioned anything similar. I tried to talk to a couple of coworkers I trusted. Mirrors, I said cautiously. In the waiting area. My reflection didn't breathe. They laughed, nervously at first. Yeah, right. Desert stress, one of them said. But when I pushed, describing exactly how it moved and didn't move, they exchanged glances. One guy shrugged. Keep your distance. Don't read too much into those rooms. That area has been off limits for years. Only contractors and clearance personnel get brief access. After that, I kept my eyes away whenever I had to wait for clearance. I learned to glance at the door, not the mirrors, to avoid that sense of wrongness in the pit of my stomach. But the memory lingered. Sometimes I dream of it, my reflection standing still while I moved, following me from room to room, an empty version of me just watching. Weeks later, I finished the project and drove back home. I tried not to think about it, but every time I passed mirrored windows, every time I saw a reflection in a darkened storefront, I caught myself holding my breath just in case. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a version of me that didn't follow normal rules, something waiting to move differently, to be out of sync. I never went back to that part of the base. I don't talk about it much. But when I close my eyes at night, I can still picture it. The mirrored walls, the waiting, and the reflection that didn't breathe when I did. I worked as a maintenance tech at the Nevada Test and Training Range from 2015 to 2018. My shift mostly involved checking perimeter lighting, repairing fencing, and running diagnostic checks on hangars and other support buildings. Most nights were boring, the kind of quiet where the desert itself seems to swallow sound, leaving you aware of every gust of wind and the crunch of your own boots. There was one hangar I never really understood, Building 23, or at least that's what the maps called it. It was on the far west side of the base, cordoned off with double fencing, heavy padlocks, and a warning, no entry, high security. From what I could see through the narrow observation windows, it was empty. Empty for decades, my supervisor said. Records showed nothing had been stored there in at least 30 years. And yet, every few weeks, late at night, the floodlights around the hangar would flare on. Not a quick flicker. Full, bright, running for hours. Sometimes we'd notice it on routine checks. Sometimes someone in the control tower would call it in. It would burn steadily for 4 or 5 hours, then cut off without warning. The first time I saw it, I was driving past on my evening rounds. The sky had been clear, a pale crescent moon over the desert, wind low but dry. I slowed as I approached the hangar. The floodlights were blazing, casting long shadows across the sand. My first thought was that a crew had left them on by mistake, maybe doing some late test or moving equipment. I checked the control shack. No scheduled work, no vehicles, no personnel. I radioed the tower. Unit 7 checking floodlights on 23. Any authorized activity? Negative, the reply came. No scheduled access. Lights are probably on timers. Continue rounds. Timers didn't explain the length. I drove closer, trying to get a better look. From the road, the windows were black, no motion inside, no heat signatures on the external sensors we'd installed after some earlier unauthorized access incidents. The desert around it was empty, I couldn't make sense of it, so I logged it and moved on. Over the next several weeks, the pattern repeated. Always late at night, always for hours. Sometimes the lights would flare as I approached, sometimes they were already on. Always the same, full intensity, steady, no signs of movement inside. Occasionally, the desert wind would carry faint mechanical sounds, almost like a generator, but when I checked, none were running. I started timing my rounds to see if I could catch anything. One night, I parked 50 meters away, keeping the truck's engine running, watching. The lights came on exactly at 1:37 a.m. I kept notes. Shadows from the fencing shifted slightly, as if the floodlights themselves were moving, though I knew they weren't. I sat for 3 hours. Nothing else changed. No figures, no vehicles, no sound beyond the wind and the occasional rattle of distant fencing. When I asked my supervisor, Chief Harmon, about it, he gave the same line every time. Nothing in 23, Nathan. Records confirm empty for decades. Don't worry about it. You're seeing things. I tried to drop it. Worked nights, saw some strange stuff out here, and part of the job was ignoring what you couldn't explain. But the hangar lights had a rhythm, a presence almost. On some nights, I swear the intensity changed if you looked directly at it, like it was aware you were watching. A few months in, I mentioned it to Luis, a fellow tech. He'd been with the base much longer than me. Lights in 23, I said quietly over coffee in the break room. You ever see them go on? He looked around, lowered his voice. Yeah, I've been here 22 years. Never seen anyone go in, never seen anything leave. But yeah, the lights flare sometimes. We just pretend it's a system glitch. Don't look too hard. We started comparing notes. Nights when the lights were on, wind direction, moon phase. Nothing consistent, nothing that made sense. But there was one thing we both noticed. The lights were always brightest when the desert was still, wind calm, temperature just right. When it was stormy or gusty, nothing. One night I got curious. I snuck closer, parked just outside the fence, binoculars in hand. The lights flared exactly at 2-3 a.m., just like before. I leaned in, trying to see shadows through the blacked-out windows. That's when I noticed something subtle, a vibration in the air. Not from the lights themselves, but a low hum, almost imperceptible, like something resonating inside the hangar. It lasted only a few seconds, then stopped. No doors, no movement, nothing, just silence and the lights continuing to burn as if nothing had happened. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and the hum was gone. I looked at the windows. Nothing had changed. After that night, I started noticing little things. The desert air near the hangar sometimes smelled different. Metallic, ozone-like, faint, gone within minutes. Footsteps in the sand near the fencing that disappeared when I approached. Occasionally, a shadow would flicker behind the black windows, even when the lights were off. I reported it once more formally. Nathan, leave 23 alone, Chief Harmon said. Records are clear, nothing inside. Don't get ideas about sneaking closer. You're making it worse. I obeyed, but I couldn't stop looking. Driving past the hangar late at night, I'd see the floodlights flare again unprovoked. I could almost feel the vibration before it started, like a pulse in the quiet desert. I never went closer than a few hundred meters after that. Eventually, I finished my rotation and left the base. I moved back to Reno, trying to forget about it. But even now, when I drive past stretches of desert or see tall hangars at night, I remember that slow flare of floodlights and the way the air would feel just before. Something was in 23, or it wasn't. Either way, it was alive in a sense, and I never could figure out what. The records never changed. Maps showed it empty. Supervisors swore it had been abandoned for decades. And yet, every few weeks, the lights flare. Long, steady, impossible to explain, like someone or something was inside, waiting. I'd been running patrols around the Nevada Test and Training Range for a little over 3 years when it happened. My name's Tyler Dre, and I was on a week-long night rotation in April 2017. The desert was cold at night, even in spring, and the wind that week had been blowing sharp gusts that rattled the fence lines and kicked up dust across the road. I was driving the northern loop with my partner, Sergeant Mallory, around 1:30 a.m., the headlights cutting through the sand haze. Most of the night was uneventful. Occasional coyote calls, the low hum of distant generators, the occasional blinking lights from other patrol trucks. But around mile marker 17, near a dry wash we sometimes called Devil's Run, we spotted something that didn't belong. A patch of sand, maybe 20 feet across, stained a dark, almost crimson color. At first, I thought it was spilled oil or some sort of chemical, but the color was wrong, too deep, too uneven. It had this strange sheen, like it had absorbed the light of our headlights and was still glowing faintly. "Shit," Mallory muttered. He stopped the truck a few feet from it. "That doesn't look right." I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out. The air was still except for the wind tossing little grains of sand. I crouched down to look closer. The stain had no odor, nothing like I'd expect from blood or chemicals, and yet it had the same viscosity. The edges weren't clean. It almost looked like it had seeped up from underneath. "We need a sample," I said, pulling on gloves. Mallory handed me a small, sterile container from the kit in the truck. I scooped up a handful, but as soon as I did, the material started disappearing. Not sliding or dripping, just fading. Within seconds, the sand in the container was gone. Nothing remained. "What the hell?" I muttered, shaking the empty container. Mallory stepped closer, flashlight in hand. "Try another spot," he said cautiously. I did. Another scoop, same result. By the time we had tried 3 different samples, the sand in each had evaporated entirely before it could even be sealed. It didn't smell, didn't burn, didn't leave residue. It just wasn't there anymore. We reported it to dispatch. Standard protocol said to bring it back to the lab, but I had nothing to give them. The officer on the radio went quiet for a moment before responding. "Unit 5, we've logged it. Document the coordinates and return to your patrol. No explanation, no further instructions." Over the next week, we returned to the site during our shifts. Each time, the patch had the same dark stain, slightly different in shape, like it had shifted or spread in the sand. Once, I watched it for almost 10 minutes from the truck. The wind had died down completely. The sand didn't move, didn't swirl, but the patch seemed off. Almost like it was thicker than the surrounding sand, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. We tried taking photos. The camera worked, but when we reviewed the shots later, the stains looked washed out, muted, almost gray. Not dark red at all, as they had appeared in real life. Mallory started talking about seeing figures in the distance, just at the edge of his vision. Shadows that vanished when he tried to focus on them. I didn't see them at first, chalking it up to exhaustion, the constant wind and dust playing tricks on our eyes. But one night I noticed something too. A ripple in the sand beyond the wash, moving too slowly for a person, too patterned for the wind, like someone, or something, was pacing, then stopping abruptly when I turned to look directly at it. We never went closer than 50 feet to the patch after that. We logged every observation, times, weather conditions, wind direction, GPS coordinates. Nothing in the records explained it. Every sample evaporated. Every photo rendered it dull and lifeless. No one else wanted to come near that stretch, and after a while, even dispatch stopped asking for updates. I started noticing other anomalies during those shifts. At random times, the desert would fall unnaturally silent. Coyotes wouldn't howl, wind would stop mid-gust. The stars would seem to pulse faintly, just on the edge of your vision, and when you blinked, they were steady again. I told myself it was fatigue, desert isolation, the brain filling in gaps, but deep down, I knew that patch of sand wasn't normal. It was alive in a way you couldn't measure or contain. Months later, I found myself back in Las Vegas, driving home after my last rotation. I tried to forget about it, but the memory of that patch kept surfacing. Occasionally, when I drove past desert stretches on the outskirts of town, I felt the same pull. The quiet desert, the way light seemed to cling unnaturally to flat sand, the sense of something watching just beyond sight. I never got an explanation. Lab techs never asked for samples because, as far as the base logs show, none ever existed. And though I returned to civilian life, I couldn't shake the feeling that the desert still had that patch somewhere, spreading quietly, resisting observation, like it had a purpose I couldn't comprehend. Even now, years later, when I fly over desert highways at night, I scan the ground below, and sometimes I swear I can see a faint dark stain stretching across the sand, holding itself there, stubbornly, impossibly, while the world around it moves on. I was working nights at the Nevada Test and Training Range in the summer of 2018. I'd just been assigned to a temporary crew that set up mobile radar and communications equipment for the flight tests near one of the auxiliary runways. My name's Jason Miller, and at the time, I'd been doing this kind of work for a few years, mostly long nights, minimal supervision, and an empty desert that made you feel both free and isolated at the same time. We arrived around 10 p.m., the sun long gone behind the mountains, and the desert already dropping to a sharp, cool temperature. The wind was calm, which was rare. Usually at that hour, it gusted, carrying dust across the asphalt. Our trucks rolled along the perimeter as we set up generators, antennas, and cable runs. I was driving one of the smaller trucks, checking lights and prepping the power lines. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was other crew members, or maybe security, standing in the middle of the runway. They were perfectly still, spaced evenly, facing us as we drove closer. Something about them felt wrong. They weren't waving, signaling, or acknowledging the vehicles, just standing there like statues. "Do you see that?" I asked over the radio, voice low. My partner, Mike Harris, was in the other truck about 50 feet ahead. "Yeah," he said, static in his channel. "Weird as hell." I slowed the truck to a crawl. The shapes didn't move. No wind disturbed their clothes, no light reflected off them the way it did with us. I noticed their shadows, or the lack of them. They cast nothing. The moonlight and our headlights didn't make them real in the way people usually are. "Maybe some prank?" Mike suggested, but I couldn't shake the sense that wasn't it. The desert was quiet, too quiet. Even the crickets and distant generators had fallen away. I brought the truck closer, the engine idling. My headlights washed over one figure directly ahead. It looked human, but its stance was too rigid. The arms hung straight down, fingers stiff. The head tilted slightly, but it didn't shift as I passed. My stomach tightened. Before I could say anything else, we noticed a faint smell, something acrid, like burnt plastic. The shapes, as we approached within 20 feet, seemed to vanish. Not run, not turn, just gone. The desert in front of us was empty. That's when I saw the marks. Where the figures had been standing, the asphalt was scorched. Not cracks or chips, but black, thin burn marks in exact humanoid shapes. I leaned out of the window to inspect them. The smell lingered stronger there. Mike stopped the truck behind me, camera out, snapping a few photos. When we reviewed them later, the scorch patterns were there, detailed outlines of bodies, but no one in sight. We circled the runway looking for security or anyone else who could explain it. Nothing. No footprints leading away, no vehicles, nothing in the brush. The area was dead quiet, like we'd imagined the figures into existence. That night, we kept working, though our pace slowed. Every so often, I thought I'd see them again at the far end of the runway, tiny silhouettes against the dark horizon. But whenever we approached, there was nothing, just more faint scorch marks as if they had relocated and disappeared again. Over the next few nights, the same thing happened. Different sections of runway, slightly different times. Sometimes we would be alone setting up radar dishes, and out of the corner of our eyes, figures would appear. Still, motionless, sometimes facing us, sometimes turned away. Every time we got closer, the desert would look empty, the asphalt marked with burnt shapes. No footprints, no shadows, no evidence of someone running. Dispatch and the supervisors weren't helpful. "Check your equipment," one said. "You're probably tired." Desert mirages are common. But we weren't imagining the scorch marks. We photographed them, documented them, even had the lab analyze the residue. It burned, but nothing remained after a few hours, like everything they touched evaporated. I stopped trying to rationalize it. There was no wind damage, no chemical residue we recognized. Nothing alive could have done that without leaving traces. I even tried driving alone down the runway at different hours. Sometimes I'd see movement, fleeting shadows in the dark, other times, nothing at all. The last night I worked there, I remember standing at the edge of the runway around 2 a.m., checking cable connections. I felt watched. A soft vibration in the air, almost imperceptible, like static energy or a pressure wave. I looked down the runway. At least 3 figures appeared, perfectly still, lined up across the tarmac. My flashlight flicked over them. They didn't move. My stomach turned. I wanted to run, but I was frozen for a moment. Then, slowly, they vanished again. Where they had stood, the asphalt glowed faintly, blackened lines etched in the dim light. No heat, just marks. I got back in the truck, radioed Mike to meet me at the lot, and we left immediately, not daring to stop again. I haven't been back since. Every so often, I drive past the edge of the desert on the highway, glance out toward the old runways, and sometimes, in the faint light of distant base floodlights, I think I can see silhouettes, still, perfectly aligned, waiting or watching. Even years later, I tell myself it's stress, exhaustion, heat mirages, but the scorch marks are burned into my memory, and the smell of acrid plastic still lingers in my dreams, like something alive touched the desert and refused to leave. I was going through some old storage boxes at home a few months back, trying to declutter, when I came across a stack of photos my grandfather had kept. He was a retired airman, Charles Chuck Whitman, and spent most of his career around the Nevada Test and Training Range. I'd grown up hearing stories about the base, Area 51, all the usual stuff, secret projects, experimental aircraft, but never much concrete. I guess I thought the stories were just that, stories. Anyway, these photos were mostly black and white from the 50s. Chuck had labeled some of them, mostly snapshots of runways, barracks, the occasional aircraft lined up neatly on the tarmac. Nothing too unusual. I was flipping through them on a rainy Sunday morning, sunlight dim through the blinds, when I stopped at one photo that didn't make sense. It was a standard runway shot, taken from what looked like a guard tower. You could see a few trucks and personnel moving about. Nothing that screamed classified at first glance. But then I noticed something in the background, half hidden behind a hangar. A craft. It was small, sleek, dark, with a shape that didn't resemble anything I recognized from the period. No wings like a jet, no tail fins, just smooth, almost teardrop-shaped. The strange part, it looked identical to a prototype I'd seen a few years ago during a test briefing at the base. Same size, same shape, same metallic reflection. I blinked a few times, leaning closer. Couldn't be. That aircraft shouldn't exist in the 50s. I called my cousin, Matt, who's a hobbyist historian with a focus on Cold War aviation. He looked at it over video chat, adjusting the contrast and zooming in on the background. "That's weird," he said finally. "It looks like one of the newer stealth test drones, but this photo is dated 1954. How does that even happen?" I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe the labeling was wrong. But then I pulled out more photos from the same box, various angles of the same base, all from the early 50s. Each time, in the same corner of the frame, there it was. Always partially obscured, never fully in focus, almost like someone, or something, was careful not to let you get a clear look. That evening, I dug out some of Chuck's old notebooks. They weren't much at first, flight logs, maintenance notes, but in one of the later journals dated 1953, I found a reference to a special operations prototype with only a vague description. Unconventional, smooth, unmarked, observed only in limited test conditions. No drawings, no technical details. I drove down to the range the next morning. I figured maybe seeing the area would help me contextualize what I'd found. The desert was quiet, early fog rolling off the mountains. I parked near the perimeter, far enough to avoid attention, and watched the horizon. Not more than 30 minutes in, I saw a glint, a shape rising from behind one of the distant hangars. It hovered briefly, then shot straight up at a speed that made me stumble back. My camera's autofocus freaked out. I managed a single frame before it vanished behind a low bank of clouds. The weirdest part wasn't just seeing the craft. It was that when I checked the photo, there was a faint haze, almost like static, covering the shape. The camera had registered movement, but somehow the outline wasn't fully there. My heart was racing, and I noticed that my surroundings felt different. The desert was too quiet. No birds, no wind, not even the usual hum from the distant generators. Just that odd, empty silence. I stayed for a couple more hours, watching. Every now and then, small lights would flicker across the horizon, like someone moving reflective markers, except nothing appeared on the ground when I tried to track them. I felt like I was being watched, though every time I spun around, there was no one. Just the desert, the mountains, and the base perimeter fencing. On my way back, I noticed my car felt lighter. Not physically, but the sense that something had changed in my perspective. Like time had stretched, then compressed. I got home and everything seemed normal, except for the photo I had taken. Half the image was blank where the craft had been. I tried reloading it, connecting the SD card to my computer, even opening it in different programs. Nothing. It just wouldn't show the craft. I couldn't stop thinking about the photo from the 50s. How had that craft been there? Was someone testing advanced technology decades ahead of schedule, or was it something else entirely? Chuck never mentioned anything like that in his journals, at least not in words I could understand. And the craft I saw rising from behind the hangar looked identical, down to the subtle curvature of its body, to the one in the old photograph. The following week, I went back to the storage box just to see if I had missed anything. There were more photos, more angles, but in all of them, the craft was there, partially hidden, always in the background. The more I looked, the more I felt like it had been watching, like it didn't want to be fully seen. I tried asking around carefully to people I trusted. Nobody had seen anything, and some gave me that blank, uneasy look like they thought I'd gone off the deep end. Military records for that period are classified, naturally, but even among retired personnel, no one would admit to having knowledge of something like that. I kept the photos, of course. I sometimes take them out and study the hangar angles, the shadows, the background. And sometimes late at night, I imagine the craft rising from behind the hangar, just like it did that foggy morning, silent, fast, and completely untraceable. I don't know what it is, a prototype hidden for decades, something that doesn't belong to us, or maybe it's a trick of light, memory, and the desert stretching your mind. All I know is that photo doesn't lie, even if no one else can see it. And seeing that same shape today, decades later, hovering above the same base, made me realize that whatever it is, it doesn't obey our rules. I've stopped trying to explain it. I just look at the photos, sometimes the video I caught, and leave it at that. There's a line in the desert, and apparently I walked right up to it. The craft exists in the past and present, but every recording, every attempt to document it, seems determined to vanish. All I can do is keep the images, keep the memory, and accept that there's something out there that doesn't care about our timeline, our cameras, or our understanding. I went back to work, to the normal routines of life, but every now and then, when the wind shifts just right, I see that same shape in the corner of my eye, and I remember the photo from the 50s. It's still there, watching, waiting, and somehow unchanged. I was working nights at one of the smaller maintenance hangars out by Area 51 in late October 2019. My name's Daniel Kearns, and I was hired as part of a temp crew to inspect lighting and electrical wiring in some of the older hangars that weren't on the main map. They gave us minimal briefings, just safety rules, security clearances, and the usual don't ask questions talk. The hangar itself was a long, low building at the far edge of the range. Concrete floors, steel beams, some of the old riveted panels still showing rust. Most of the other hangars had functioning lights, but this one was due for a full inspection and partial rewiring. I remember it being colder than usual that night, despite a heat wave earlier in the week. The wind was calm, and the desert around the hangar was black, empty, silent. We arrived around 11 p.m., 3 of us, me, a guy named Luis, and another named Heather. We carried toolboxes, ladders, and a few portable floodlights. As soon as we switched on the lights inside, something felt off. I couldn't place it at first. The beams looked sharper than they should have, the shadows deeper, and for some reason the hangar felt longer than it had on the map. We spread out. Luis was on the far end checking conduit along the ceiling, Heather was testing the breaker panels near the middle, and I was running lights along the walls. That's when I noticed it. My shadow didn't match the light. I froze, thinking maybe it was the angle of the floodlight I was carrying. But then I saw Luis's shadow, too, leaning in the opposite direction from his flashlight. Heather called out, confused, "Are you guys seeing this?" I nodded slowly. Every shadow in the hangar was wrong. They moved in opposition to our lights. I held my flashlight over my head, pointing down. My shadow stretched toward me, curling toward the light source instead of away. I waved my arms. The shadow mimicked me perfectly, just reversed. "What the hell?" Luis muttered, stepping closer. He held his hand out, trying to trace his shadow. It didn't react to him, just stayed inverted, still perfectly sharp against the concrete floor. We grabbed cameras to document it. My phone, Luis's DSLR, Heather's GoPro. Every device failed. Nothing recorded the shadows. On my screen, the hangar looked empty except for the light cast on the floor. No reverse shadows, like nothing at all. Heather tried taking a video while panning across the hangar. The screen was blank where our shadows should have been, just static and flickers where the floodlight hit the wall. We double-checked the devices, fully charged, working memory cards. Nothing wrong. We backed up, huddling near the entry. The hangar was silent, aside from the soft hum of the lights. I swear I felt something watching, just out of the corner of my eyes. I spun slowly, but nothing was there. Still, the shadows kept moving, still inverted, always responding to our gestures in impossible ways. Luis tried an experiment. He pointed his flashlight at a wall, then stepped away, letting it sweep across the floor. The shadows stretched backward as if the light were coming from a different source entirely. He waved, crouched, jumped, and the shadows mimicked him precisely in reverse. We were speechless. We spent the next hour testing it, trying to figure out if it was a wiring issue, a reflective surface, something in the paint. Nothing explained it. The shadows were too consistent, too precise. When we looked through the cameras again, nothing appeared. Even taking photos of the floor directly under the floodlights yielded only blank concrete, lit normally. No reversed shadows. At one point, the lights flickered for a second, just enough to make the hangar half dark. In that instant, I could swear I saw figures moving at the edges of the hangar, standing in the same inverted positions as our shadows, like they had been cast from some unseen source. Then the lights stabilized, and they were gone. We decided to finish the maintenance and get out. The wiring itself went fine, but every step toward the exit felt heavier. I kept checking my own shadow, moving my flashlight in front of me, trying to see if it would obey physics again. It didn't. As we walked out, I noticed the floor outside. The sand and concrete seemed normal, shadows acting right, sun just starting to rise over the mountains. Back at the base housing, we tried showing other people the footage. Security, supervisors, other techs. No one could see anything. The footage appeared normal, no inverted shadows, nothing strange at all. I went back once a week after that for follow-up work. Each night the hangar was the same. Shadows reversed, cameras unable to capture them, that quiet, uneasy feeling pressing down. One night I caught a glimpse of movement behind the inverted shadows, something standing where a shadow should have been, perfectly still, then gone when I turned fully to face it. I stopped bringing my phone in after a while. Nothing could record it anyway. I started leaving the hangar alone after hours. Even years later, I think about that place. Sometimes when I stand in my backyard at night, the shadows from the streetlights seem to twitch just slightly against the natural direction of light. Small things. But I notice them, and I think of that hangar. The shadows don't follow normal rules there. They exist on their own terms, independent of light, independent of physics, and cameras, electronics, nothing can capture them. The memory sticks, the SD cards, the phones, they all fail. I don't know what we saw. I don't know why it was only that hangar. I don't know if anyone else has seen it or if it's just one of those things that belongs to the desert and the base, quietly defying explanation. I can tell you one thing. I've worked around lights and shadows my whole life. Never anything like this. Even now, years later, when I think about it, I get the same feeling I did stepping inside that hangar. Like the darkness itself was watching, waiting, and the shadows weren't ours at all. I was driving back from Vegas one hot August evening, the kind of heat that makes the desert shimmer and bends the horizon in weird ways. My name's Danny Morales, and I've lived in Pahrump for most of my life. That stretch of highway between the town and the Groom Lake area is usually empty at night, nothing but dust and the occasional coyote darting across the asphalt. I keep a beat-up old camera in the car, mostly for storms or long sunsets. That night, I had it out because the sky was clear and I wanted to try some time-lapse shots of the stars. I'd gone about halfway when something caught the corner of my eye, way off in the distance. Past the base fences and hills, a sudden flare. Not like lightning, Not like a plane hitting the horizon, just a pure white flash that lit up the whole valley for a few seconds. I slammed the brakes, trying to get the camera trained on it. My stomach sank. It was too clean, too intense, like someone had turned on a giant bulb directly behind the mountains. I jumped out of the truck, rolling the camera to a tripod. The light flared again, this time broader, almost filling the sky with a white glow tinged orange at the edges. I could see the desert outlines illuminated, shadows stretching miles across the valley floor. And yet there wasn't a sound. No boom, no crackle, no hum. I thought maybe it was a lightning strike bouncing off clouds, but the sky was completely clear. The camera recorded a few frames, but when I looked through the viewfinder, the image kept freezing. Not lagging, just stopping for a long moment on a single frame where the light seemed to expand into a sort of dome, hovering just above the horizon. When it unfroze, the light was gone. The desert was back to normal, like nothing had happened, but my heart was racing. I checked my watch. 15 minutes had passed. I swore I'd only been out there for a few seconds. I drove a little closer to the base perimeter, careful not to get too obvious. The fence was dark, the security lights casting pale circles on the sand, but no movement. No response from the base. And here's the thing. For the next hour, I kept seeing flickers, shadows that didn't make sense. Hills would flash white, like reflections, then disappear. Sometimes the shape of the light looked almost structured, like it was made of panels or facets rather than just fire or energy. I tried calling the sheriff's office, hoping maybe someone else had seen it. The line rang once, then went dead. I tried my phone again. Dead signal. No bars at all, right there on the main road. I laughed nervously, muttering to myself about cell towers in the desert, but the unease didn't go away. I felt watched, like someone or something was standing just beyond my sight, waiting. I kept glancing at the hills, and every time I did, I thought I saw movement that could have been a person, a vehicle, something. Then nothing. I parked a bit off the highway, trying to steady my nerves. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. I wanted proof. Another flare lit the sky, and this one was massive. The ground around me glowed, but again, no sound. I could see my own shadow on the truck hood stretch unnaturally long. The horizon flickered with the light, and for the briefest moment, it looked like the base itself had lifted slightly above the ground. Just for a second, like a mirage, before snapping back to normal. I drove back slowly, keeping my eyes on the hills, the empty desert. By the time I got home, the light had stopped. My hands were shaking. I checked the footage immediately. The time-lapse had recorded something, but all the frames with the big flares were corrupt, just white smudges. Only the frames before and after were usable, and those showed normal desert, normal road, nothing unusual. The next day I tried calling around, asking locals if anyone had seen the massive light show. Nothing. One guy in town said he'd noticed the sky kind of glow weird, but couldn't give me a time or place. I checked the news, FAA reports, even military press releases. Zero mention of anything. It was as if it had never happened. Weeks later, I went back to the highway to see if I could get another shot, maybe catch something else. The desert was quiet, hotter than before, the dust rising in small columns. I parked near the same spot, waited until after midnight. Nothing happened. I stayed until dawn. Still nothing. It was just gone. I keep thinking about that frozen frame on the camera. The dome of light hovering, edges glinting like metal just above the horizon. Not a reflection, not a natural phenomenon I can name. Something in the way it expanded, then vanished, was deliberate. Intentional. Watching. I can't explain how it could appear like that, miles away, flash so brightly, and leave no trace. No sound, no heat, no official record. Sometimes, driving back home late at night, I swear I see that faint white glow on the horizon again. Always brief, always on the edge of perception. I've stopped trying to record it. The last thing I want is for the camera to freeze again, leaving me staring at a single frame that holds more than I can handle. I tell people about it, carefully, and most just shake their heads. Desert mirages, they say. Maybe. But I remember the way the light spread across the desert floor, the way the hills seemed to bend around it, and the silence. Absolute silence. Nothing in this world makes that happen. I don't go near that part of the range anymore. I keep my distance, stay on paved roads, and avoid looking at the horizon too long when I'm out at night. But sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I catch that flicker in the corner of my eye, a flash of white, a hint of orange along the edge, and I remember that night, miles from anywhere, when the sky itself exploded, and no one officially ever saw it. I was finishing my shift late one night, hauling some equipment out toward the test range. My name's Marcus Hale. I've been doing maintenance work at the base for a few years, mostly electrical and light construction stuff. The roads out there are empty at night, just long stretches of desert and the faint hum of generators somewhere far off. That night, it was unusually clear. No wind, no clouds, the kind of black sky that makes the stars pop so bright you almost feel like you could fall into them. I was driving the last mile of gravel road, headlights barely cutting through the dark, when I saw them. At first, I thought they were mirages or a trick of the moonlight, but they moved too deliberately. A line of trucks, maybe 4 or 5, moving across the desert floor. No headlights, no taillights, no sound. They weren't on any road I knew, just gliding over the sand in perfect formation. I slowed the truck, my stomach tightening. I double-checked my eyes, expecting them to vanish, but they didn't. They were huge, boxy, unmarked, and completely silent. The desert sand didn't kick up around them like it should have. It was like they were gliding on air. My first instinct was to turn around, but curiosity kept me rooted. I watched them for a good minute before realizing I should probably call it in. When I reached the checkpoint, the base was quiet. Guards were inside their huts, the usual fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. I radioed it in, trying to keep my voice steady. "Control, this is Hale. I've got a visual on multiple trucks, unmarked, moving across the desert floor near Sector 7. No lights, no sound. Requesting confirmation or guidance." Static, then a faint voice, too calm. "Affirmative, Hale. Proceed as normal. No anomalies reported." I frowned and repeated myself. The voice came back the same, clipped, almost like it was pre-recorded. "Proceed as normal," it said. That didn't sit right, but the line went dead after that. I drove to a safe distance and tried to get a photo with my phone. The screen flickered, then froze, then went black. I cursed under my breath, shaking the device. I could still see the trucks in the corner of my eye, moving steadily across the sand. My truck's headlights made faint shadows, and I noticed something else. Where the trucks moved, the sand looked darker, almost wet, but I couldn't see any movement in it. No dust, nothing scattering like it should. I stayed for maybe another 10 minutes before finally deciding to leave. When I glanced back, the trucks were gone. No flash of light, no sound, nothing. Just empty desert. The sand smooth and pale as if nothing had moved across it. The next morning I went back to the same stretch, hoping maybe the light of day would help me figure out what I'd seen. Nothing. The sand was just sand. No tracks, no marks, no darker patches. I asked around, other night shift workers, maintenance guys, even the drivers who sometimes haul test equipment. No one saw anything. Later, I checked the security cameras covering the desert from the base towers. I shouldn't have. I knew it might be a bad idea, but I had to confirm what I'd seen. Every feed I pulled up was normal. Static desert, no trucks, no shadows, nothing. I rewound the footage, fast-forwarded it, adjusted the contrast, zoomed in, even tried enhancing the images on a laptop. All I got was empty desert. I reported it anyway because that's the procedure. The supervisor listened, nodding, typing something into a terminal. He didn't ask questions about what they looked like, how they moved, nothing. Just typed, nodded, and said, "Footage shows no anomalies. Must be a trick of the light. Documented for record." It bothered me for days. The more I tried to rationalize it, the less sense it made. I kept picturing them gliding across the desert, silent, unlit, and perfectly spaced, like some kind of phantom convoy. The sand, darker than it should have been, and the way my camera froze when I tried to capture them. I started noticing little things afterward. On my way to the base, streetlights would flicker when I passed certain points. Sometimes I'd swear I saw movement in the desert behind fences, shadows that weren't my own. Once I thought I saw one of the trucks parked far off, just standing in the sand. Then a gust of wind, or maybe something else, made it vanish before I could focus on it. I asked a few coworkers if they'd ever seen anything unusual on the range at night. A couple mentioned strange lights, weird reflections, or distant hums, but no one talked about the trucks. Or maybe they didn't see them, or maybe they had and didn't report. It's hard to tell who's telling the truth in places like this. One night, I drove past the same area just to check. No trucks, no lights, nothing. But the desert felt different, like it was holding its breath. I kept imagining that silent convoy, trucks gliding without touching the sand, and I felt watched, though I couldn't see anyone. I thought about it a lot, about how the footage didn't match reality, how no one else seemed to notice anything, and how the trucks made the sand look wrong. I've come to accept that I'll probably never know what I saw. I don't talk about it much anymore, except with a few people who work the night shifts and notice the little anomalies themselves. The last time I checked, I drove the stretch again, camera in hand. Nothing happened. But sometimes late at night, I still picture them moving silently across the desert, far beyond any road, leaving no trace, no sound, nothing. Just perfect, empty sand where something shouldn't have been. I keep my distance now. Stick to main roads, stay within sight of lights. And yet, when I close my eyes at night, I can still see that silent convoy gliding across the desert, a strange, impossible parade that only I witnessed, if I even did. I was called in around 11 p.m. for a maintenance check on a restricted hangar I'd only ever heard about in passing. My name's Riley Foster. I do comms and equipment maintenance at the base, mostly at night shifts when things are quiet. The hangar wasn't on any standard map I'd been given, just a plain metal building with a big sealed door labeled Authorized Personnel Only, the kind of place that already made your stomach tighten when you got near it. When I arrived, a sergeant was waiting outside. He barely looked at me, just handed me a key card and a flashlight. 10 minutes. Check the wiring. That's it. No detours, he said, glancing nervously toward the hangar like it was alive. His tone was sharp, but there was a kind of unease in his eyes. I nodded, tried to joke about how restrictive the place looked, but he didn't respond. Just watched me until I swiped the card and the door clicked open. The inside was bigger than it looked from the outside, a hollow rectangle of concrete and metal. It smelled faintly of ozone, and the lights overhead buzzed with a low, constant hum. I flicked on my flashlight, walking toward the main panel along the wall. The air was heavy, almost too still, and I remember feeling that weird sensation of being watched. I laughed it off, muttering to myself, thinking I'd been staring at screens and circuits too long. I started checking the panel, testing connections, flipping breakers. Everything seemed normal, except for a faint vibration underfoot, like the floor itself was humming. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it made my teeth buzz a little when I hummed along with it. I glanced around. The hangar was empty, or at least it looked empty. That's when I noticed the shadows. At first I thought it was my flashlight flickering, but the shadows didn't match my movement. When I moved left, they moved right. When I stepped back, they didn't budge. I froze, staring. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light bouncing off some metal panels. Then I saw the faint outline. It wasn't solid, more like a blur, just at the edge of my vision. I swung the flashlight around. Nothing. I told myself I was imagining it. My heartbeat sped up, but I kept working, checking wiring, flipping breakers. I remember thinking I was careful not to look away for too long, not to give whatever it was a chance to notice me. Somewhere in that stretch, the hum got louder, more insistent, like it was pressing against my ears. My watch beeped. It was 11:10 p.m. I had just started. 10 minutes, I reminded myself. Check, log, and get out. The weird part is the next memory. I was walking back to the door, light flickering across the panels, and I remember reaching for the handle. I swear I was only in there for maybe 10 minutes. I pushed the door, and the hangar was quiet, normal. I stepped out into the desert night, the stars sharp above me, the air dry and cool. I walked back to my truck, feeling like I'd been holding my breath the entire time. That's when I looked at my watch. 2:05 a.m., I froze. I checked it again. No, still 2:05. My log sheet, the panel clock, everything I could see confirmed it. I had been in the hangar for over 3 hours. I sat in my truck for a minute, trying to reconcile it. My memory said 10 minutes. I tried to replay everything in my head, every step, every sound, every shadow. Nothing happened for 3 hours, yet the watch said otherwise. I even asked the sergeant, who looked at me with that same tight, controlled expression. 10 minutes. That's what you were supposed to take. Nothing else matters. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't press. I drove back toward the main base, windows down, letting the cold desert air slap my face. The hum from the hangar seemed to follow me, fading slowly but lingering in my ears. I kept glancing in the rear view, expecting lights or shapes in the desert behind me, but there was nothing. Over the next few days, I tried to fill in the gaps. I checked cameras outside the hangar. Footage only showed me entering and leaving, exactly 10 minutes apart. No 3 hours missing. No shadows. Nothing in the hangar moved except me. I even asked the night crew if they'd seen anything unusual. One guard said the wind was picking up that night, which I knew wasn't true. The weather logs showed calm all evening. Everyone else shrugged, gave vague answers. I started noticing little things after that. My flashlight would flicker when I walked near the hangar, even during the day. Sometimes I'd swear I caught movement at the edges of my vision, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. On nights when I drove past the building, I had this sense that it was watching me back, silent, waiting. I kept my routine. Maintenance work, comms checks, the usual night shift monotony, but I never stayed long near that hangar anymore. I avoid looking at it too long. I don't linger by the panel room. I tell myself it was just a glitch, sleep deprivation, stress, something rational. But deep down, I know something about that hangar isn't normal. The thing that really gets to me is the missing time. How could 3 hours just vanish from memory? How could my watch mark them, but my mind refused to hold a single second of it? I've worked nights long enough to know when I'm tired, when I'm spacing out, and this wasn't that. My body logged it, my watch logged it, but my brain didn't. I tried talking to other technicians who worked at night. A few nodded knowingly when I mentioned restricted hangars, off-the-map buildings. They gave me vague warnings, smiles that didn't reach their eyes. One guy told me quietly, "Don't let them know you noticed the time." I didn't ask who they were. I didn't want an answer. Since then, I check my watch constantly when I'm around that hangar. Nothing makes sense. I keep replaying the night in my head. I can't explain the vibration under my feet, the shadows moving wrong, the hum that seemed almost alive. The 3 hours are gone from memory, like I blinked and skipped a chapter of reality. I don't go near that hangar at night unless I have to. When I do, I stick to the edges, keep my eyes on the floor, keep my flashlight trained on the panels, and avoid thinking about what might be happening just out of sight. I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but it left me with the strange certainty that some parts of the base don't obey normal rules. Sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night, I check my watch. 2:05 a.m. keeps flashing in my mind. I don't know why that number sticks or why my memory refuses to fill in the time I lost. I try to sleep, but I can't stop thinking about the hangar, about what was inside, and about those missing hours. I've gone back to work. Life continues. The base continues. But every time I drive past that metal building, I feel it watching, waiting. I keep my distance, but I know I'll never understand what happened in those 3 hours, or why my mind refused to record a single moment of it. I was finishing up my shift late one night, around 2 a.m., sweeping floors in one of the older lab buildings on the east side of the base. My name's Marcus Lane, and I've been a janitor here for nearly 6 years. I usually work nights, mostly cleaning offices and storage areas while everyone else sleeps. This lab I'm talking about, it's always been off limits. Sealed doors, warning signs, and a security keypad that I never had access to. But someone had left it unlocked that night, probably by accident, or maybe one of the techs forgot to secure it after doing some experiment. The hallway was dimly lit, the fluorescent bulbs buzzing low, shadows stretched across the floor. I was pushing my mop bucket past the lab door when I noticed it. The metal canister. At first, I thought someone had just left it on a counter, but then I realized it was hovering, maybe a foot off the floor, just sitting there in the middle of the room. It didn't roll or sway, it just floated, perfectly still. I froze for a second. The first thought was, okay, maybe it's some magnet thing someone was testing. But the lab was sealed, and I didn't recognize any equipment that could do that. It was small, cylindrical, silver, maybe 8 inches tall, nothing extraordinary in appearance, but the way it hovered, it was wrong. I stepped inside, slowly, trying not to make noise, my mop handle trembling a little. The air was dry and cold, colder than the rest of the building, and there was this faint hum I hadn't noticed before. I reached out a hand cautiously. My fingers brushed the bottom of the canister, and it dropped instantly to the floor with a soft clang. I almost jumped back. I stared at it for a moment, thinking I should just leave it alone, call maintenance or security, something official. But curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down and tapped it lightly. Nothing happened. No movement, no lights, no sound. Just the cold metal against my fingers. I decided to finish my cleaning. I swept around it carefully, trying not to touch it again. Every few minutes I'd glance back, half expecting it to be gone, but it stayed where it was, just sitting there on the floor. I kept thinking maybe someone would come in and claim it, but the hallway stayed empty. After maybe 15 minutes, I leaned against the counter to rest and blinked. When I looked back, the canister was floating again, exactly where it had been when I first saw it. No explanation. No wires, no strings, no magnets. It hovered, unshaken, like I hadn't touched it at all. My stomach tightened, a low kind of panic settling in. I stepped back. My hands were sweaty, and I felt stupid even thinking about it. Probably a trick of the light, I muttered to myself, but I knew that wasn't it. The shadows didn't match anything in the room, and the air still hummed faintly. I backed out slowly, never taking my eyes off it. I pressed the door closed behind me, leaning against it to steady my breathing. That was the first night, but it didn't end there. A few nights later, I had to go back to that same lab for a routine floor cleaning. I tried to ignore the canister entirely, hoping it wouldn't be there. But when I entered, it was hovering in the exact same spot, same height, same orientation. I swear to God, it hadn't moved an inch. I didn't touch it this time. I just mopped around it, careful not to get too close. But every so often, I'd catch movement at the edge of my vision. Shadows flicking across the walls, lights dimming slightly, a faint humming that seemed to respond when I paused. When I looked directly at them, nothing was there. After that night, I started noticing more things in the building. The security cameras that covered the lab would always show an empty room, even when I was standing there, sweeping around the canister. Once, I left the lab and watched the monitors in the security office from a distance. The camera feed showed the lab as empty, the canister sitting innocently on the floor, not floating. Yet when I walked back in, there it was, hovering again. I tried to tell a coworker about it, someone who had worked nights for years. I didn't mention the floating part at first, just that the canister seemed off. He gave me a look like I was crazy, then shrugged. "Stuff disappears and moves in this building all the time," he said. "That lab has been weird for years. Some techs won't even enter it alone." I pressed him, asked about the hovering, and he changed the subject fast. I started documenting it in my head, noting the nights, the times, how long I was in the lab. There was no pattern, no schedule. It didn't matter when I entered, it just appeared floating. Sometimes it would drop when I touched it, sometimes it would stay. I don't think I ever saw anyone else touch it. One night, I decided to be brave. I reached out and nudged it lightly with the mop handle. It wobbled slightly, like it had weight, then steadied itself and hovered again. My stomach turned cold. I couldn't explain it, and I couldn't rationalize it. My mind kept circling the same thought. This is not normal, and yet I was alone, with no one to confirm it, nothing to measure it with. I tried staying away after that. I let the cleaning schedule pass, avoided that wing of the lab. But the next night, I caught myself walking past, peeking in. It was still there, floating, silent, completely indifferent to my presence. I started noticing little things outside the lab, too. Lights in the hallway flickering when I walked by, like shadows moving wrong, the air getting colder without any AC or vents nearby. Sometimes I'd hear a soft thrum, like distant machinery, but when I ran to check, there was nothing. I never tried to move the canister again. I just let it float. I don't know why it did what it did, or why it kept returning to that exact spot. I don't know if it was a test, a security measure, or something else entirely. The base management never asked about it, the security cameras never recorded it, and the other techs never mentioned it. Now, I keep my distance. I do my rounds, sweep my areas, and leave that lab alone. But when I pass by at night, I can't help glancing in. I can see it hovering there, silently, waiting, and I feel that same tight knot in my stomach I felt the first time. Something about it knows when I'm looking, but it doesn't move for me, doesn't acknowledge me. I still clean that building every week. I still see the canister. I've tried to rationalize it, ignore it, forget it. But I can't. It's always in that same spot, floating. I don't understand it, and I don't think I ever will. But I keep my hands to myself and I keep my distance, because whatever it is, it's not mine to touch. And every now and then, late at night, when the hum gets just a little louder and the shadows stretch wrong, I swear I can feel it watching me back. I was on shift the night it happened, flying one of the small UAVs over the northern test range. Name's Tyler Reed. I've been doing drone ops for the government out here for about 3 years. Nothing really prepared me for what I saw that night. It was a clear, dry evening in late May. The kind of night where the desert air feels almost hollow, like sound gets swallowed. I was sitting in the ops tent, monitors glowing faintly, a strong wind rattling the canvas flaps. My job was simple: launch the drone, follow the programmed flight path, check for anomalies, record footage. Routine stuff. The UAV was prepped and checked. No issues. I ran through the systems, gave it a standard liftoff, and watched it climb steadily into the sky. Everything was normal at first. The live feed showed the usual barren desert terrain, the low hills stretching away from the base. I was scrolling through telemetry, making minor adjustments, when something caught my eye. A bright point of light far off to the northwest. It wasn't on the flight path, and it wasn't part of any scheduled exercise. It hovered there for a moment, a single intense white glow, then moved in a straight line, almost imperceptibly fast. I didn't react immediately. Light anomalies weren't uncommon, but something about the motion made my stomach tighten. Then the drone feed started acting up. A flicker, like interference, but not the usual signal glitch. The screen went fuzzy for a second, and when it cleared, the drone was gone. The telemetry readout said lost signal, which wasn't unusual if it went out of range. But this drone wasn't even halfway along its path. I tried to regain control, sending manual commands. Nothing. I zoomed in on the last feed frame, adjusting contrast, brightness, everything I could, but the image was just blank desert. No drone, no shadow, no blinking lights, nothing. I flipped to the radar feed. That's when it got weirder. The UAV had apparently ascended straight up from the point I last saw it, straight up, vertically, at a rate that was physically impossible for our equipment. The numbers on the display kept climbing. I double-checked the feed, thinking the system was malfunctioning, but the radar wasn't lying. The altitude reading shot past the operational ceiling, past any known limit, and then, just like that, it vanished entirely. No trace, no signal, nothing on thermal or infrared sensors. I sat there staring at the screens for what felt like an eternity. My fingers hovered over the console, unsure whether to call it in or not. The wind outside picked up, rattling the tent. The hum of the generators sounded louder, more intrusive. Something about the silence of the desert beyond the tent felt wrong. By then, a couple of other operators had wandered over. I described what I saw. They were skeptical, naturally. Maybe a glitch in the radar feed, one of them said. Could be a software hiccup. But there was a note in the system logs: the drone's last position, its sudden vertical movement, the telemetry spike. No one could explain it. I asked if we could check the area on the ground, see if it crashed somewhere. Security checked, sweep of the range, nothing. No debris, no signal. Nada. Just desert sand, the usual rocks, and some faint tire tracks from previous exercises. For the rest of the night, I kept the UAV console running, watching for any sign of movement, anything in the sky. There were flashes in the distance, but nothing solid, nothing that could be tracked. The desert seemed normal, almost boring, except for the absence of the drone. When the morning shift came in, I briefed the supervisors. They took notes, nodded politely, but then told me the official report would say, drone lost due to technical malfunction. Radar logs? Classified. Sensor feeds? Stored. No one else outside the ops room was allowed to see them. It was like the event never happened. I went home after my shift. The drive across the desert was quiet, the rising sun casting long shadows across the salt flats. My mind kept replaying the radar feed. The sudden vertical ascent, the impossible speed, the disappearance. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a software glitch, maybe a misread by the radar system. But every part of me knew it wasn't normal. Weeks later, I heard rumors from other ops personnel. UAVs vanish, someone said. Sometimes they come back in weird places. I pressed them for details, but no one wanted to talk. Most had seen it happen once and never mentioned it again. I still fly drones. I still work nights on the northern range. But that drone, my drone, never came back. Sometimes when I watch the sky in the middle of a quiet shift, I swear I can see something moving too fast to be anything human-made, something reflecting sunlight in a strange way, like it's aware of me. I don't know what I saw, and I don't know what happened to the drone. All I know is the desert is quieter than it should be, and the sky isn't empty. There's something out there, something fast, precise, and utterly untraceable. I've stopped trying to figure it out. I just note it in my log, do my rounds, and keep my distance. Some nights, I think about the drone. I imagine it somewhere above us, ascending straight up through the atmosphere, past the clouds, past the radar, past anything we can detect. I imagine it floating silently, untraceable, just out there, and for whatever reason, I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't malfunctioning at all. And when I look at the northern sky, late at night, I sometimes see a pinpoint of light moving too perfectly, too fast, and I wonder if that's where it went. I was working the night shift at the southern hangar that summer when it started. Name's Lucas Wren, security contractor. I'd been stationed on the perimeter for about 8 months, mostly routine patrols, checking doors, making sure no one wandered in where they weren't supposed to. Nights were quiet, too quiet sometimes, which made you notice little things that didn't quite fit. It was around 2:30 a.m., hot night outside, upper 90s, and the desert air had that dry, metallic smell after the sun went down. I just finished my rounds through the main storage bays when I got called to check the south wing of Hangar 6. Something about the request was off. It wasn't an alarm or a triggered sensor. Just a note in my log. Check hallway temperature anomaly. No explanation. I walked down the long hallway, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Normally, this place ran warm in the summer. The concrete floor absorbed heat, the steel walls radiated it. But as soon as I stepped into the hallway, my skin tightened. The air was cold, bone-deep cold that made my shirt stick to my back. I checked my handheld thermosensor. It read 35 degrees Fahrenheit. 35. In the middle of July, I rubbed my arms and called it in over the radio. South Wing, Hall 6. Temperature reading is 35. The dispatcher didn't respond. That wasn't unusual. We often got delayed replies. I pulled out my flashlight and started walking down the hall, expecting maybe a ventilation leak or an open door to a cooler storage unit. Nothing. No draft, no AC vent nearby, just that unnatural chill. I noticed my breath fogging in front of me. At first, I thought it was a trick, the cold pulling moisture out of the air, but it was too heavy, too thick for the desert in midsummer. My reflection in the polished steel doors along the hall seemed slightly off, like a ripple behind my eyes, though I shook it off. I kept walking, floorboards creaking under my boots. My radio crackled and went silent. I tried the emergency line. Dead. I muttered to myself, feeling the panic start to creep in. The further I went, the colder it got, almost like stepping into a glacier pocket. My fingers went numb inside my gloves, toes inside my boots. At the far end of the hall, I noticed something moving in the corner of my eye. A shadow? I spun around, flashlight sweeping, and saw nothing. The hall was empty. The steel doors were closed, panels locked tight. I crouched down to check the floor temperature. Concrete at ambient, normal. Only the air was freezing. I backed up a few steps and my breath formed little clouds that lingered, hovering like smoke rings before fading. I swore I heard whispers, low and unintelligible, like voices carried on the wind. But there was no wind. I flicked my flashlight up and down, trying to catch something. Nothing. Just that corridor. Perfectly straight. Perfectly cold. I reached the first doorway on the right and tried the handle. Locked. Standard for this hall. But as I pulled my badge to scan the door, the temperature spiked even colder. My breath hung thicker than ever. I could see the condensation curling around my light beam. I felt my pulse in my ears, that rapid drum of fear mixed with disbelief. Then I noticed it. Footprints on the floor, but they weren't mine. Bare footprints, perfectly spaced, moving toward the far wall. Oddly, they were frost white, like they'd been etched with ice, though no ice had formed anywhere. I crouched to touch one. Immediately, my skin tingled, hairs standing. The print wasn't cold to the touch, just wrong, like it was made of nothing solid. I took a step back, heart hammering, thinking maybe this was some maintenance prank. I radioed again, static. I tried recording on my infrared camera. I wanted proof, at least, something I could show supervisors. The camera powered up, lens blinking, but when I pointed it down the hall, the frost prints were gone. Just smooth concrete. My own prints where I'd walked earlier, but nothing else. I turned back to the corridor and realized the air had stopped freezing my skin. My breath fogged less. The temperature read normal again, 25 Celsius. I shivered, unsure if the hall had always been cold or if it had just let go. I left the hallway, checking my surroundings, flashlight sweeping. Everything seemed normal. AC running, lights flickering in the main hangar, nothing amiss. I wrote my report, noting the anomaly in my observations. Supervisors read it, nodded, and added a standard line: environmental sensors to be recalibrated. Nothing else. Over the next week, I avoided that hall when I could, but I'd catch glimpses sometimes, especially during late-night patrols. I'd hear the faint hiss of my own breath condensing, even in rooms that should have been warm. Shadows along the wall that didn't move naturally. Once, I thought I saw a shape at the far end, standing perfectly still, just slightly darker than the rest of the hallway. When I blinked, it was gone. I started noticing oddities elsewhere too. Doors I'd locked seemed unlocked. My flashlight batteries drained faster in that area. Infrared cameras recorded nothing unusual, but sometimes in playback, footage had subtle distortions, like brief frames missing or warped. My colleagues didn't notice, or maybe didn't want to. One night I went back, just to check, more out of stubbornness than curiosity. I walked slowly down the hall, breathing shallow, flashlight sweeping. Temperature dropped again as I stepped in, like fog curling from my mouth like mist from a lake. I reached the midpoint and paused. For a second I could have sworn I felt a presence, close enough to touch, just behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Only the hall, silent and empty. I left, deciding then that some things weren't meant to be understood. The hall remained unnaturally cold on occasion. Cameras never showed anything. Supervisors brushed it off, and yet, every time I walked past, my breath fogged, my skin tingled, and the air felt conscious somehow. I still work nights at the base. The hall is just part of my route now. I don't go out of my way, don't linger. Some nights I hear that whisper again, faint, as if the air itself is trying to speak. I can't explain it, and I don't know if anyone else ever will. I tell people who ask, it's just a draft, sensors are probably off. But I know what I felt that first night. I know the air could freeze me in midsummer, like my breath curling thick and white. I know those footprints weren't human, and I know I wasn't imagining it. I don't stop walking that hall, I don't stop doing my job. But I've learned to keep my distance from the cold, from the fog of breath that shouldn't exist. Some things in that hangar are not broken, they're just there, waiting. I was finishing up my late-night shift at Area 51, assigned to monitor the West hangars. Named Sam Porter, I handle a lot of the surveillance feeds and camera maintenance. Normally, nights were uneventful, the desert quiet except for the hum of generators and the occasional patrol radio chatter. That night, the sky was overcast, rare for Nevada, and there was a light mist clinging to the tarmac. Visibility wasn't great, but nothing that worried me. Around 1:45 a.m., I was checking the feed from Hangar 12. The camera was one of the older models, mounted high near the door, pointing straight at the bay where most of the new aircraft prototypes were kept. I noticed something odd. The door was cracked open slightly. Usually every bay door had to be sealed and checked by the night crew. I flagged it, thinking maybe a maintenance team had started early. I grabbed my handheld to check the sensor logs. No one had badge access that night. Doors were supposed to stay locked unless officially cleared. That didn't make sense. I double-checked the feed. Shadows moved inside the hangar, vague shapes that weren't part of the standard layout. I zoomed the camera in. It was hard to tell, mostly dark with faint reflections off the polished floor. Then I saw it, a shape moving across the bay, low to the ground, completely black, smooth, angular. It reminded me of an old stealth design, but wrong. Wrong in a way I couldn't define. I reached for the recording controls. The camera was supposed to log everything automatically, but I wanted a local backup. I hit record and watched as the shape glided toward the exit. The movement was unnatural, fluid, silent, hovering slightly above the floor. The lights overhead reflected off the body, just a hint of metal, but not enough to really call it a machine. Then came the sound, a grinding metallic screech, low and deep, reverberating in the empty hangar. Too heavy, too resonant to be just doors or rollers. I froze. I called security on the radio, trying to explain without sounding like I was losing it. West Bay, Hangar 12, movement, shape inside, sounds, metal grinding, static, nothing. I repeated myself. Still nothing. The feed cut for a few seconds. When it returned, the bay was empty. The door was closed, sealed like nothing had happened. My recorded footage ended up fragmented, little missing segments, just brief flashes of the black shape moving. Audio remained intact, though, that grinding tone impossible to ignore. I checked all nearby cameras. Nothing. No other angles captured the bay in motion. The system logs showed no recorded movement, no door opening, no badge access. It was like the hangar had been empty the entire time, except my camera caught the sound. I played back the recording repeatedly, hoping I'd missed something. The visual gaps were strange, like frames had been deliberately removed, but the grinding persisted. Heavy, dragging, resonant against the concrete. Over the next few days, I tried to make sense of it. Technicians checked the camera. It was working perfectly. No malfunctions, no glitches that would create that audio. Maintenance logs confirmed that no one had been in Hangar 12 at that hour. I asked around, quietly. Night crew claimed nothing unusual. Supervisors shrugged it off, said I must have misread the sensors or imagined the sound. But I knew what I heard. A week later, I tried a sweep with a portable thermal camera, walking the bay. No anomalies, no heat signatures, nothing out of place. I stayed until sunrise, pacing the floor, checking every corner, even touched the walls and the floor, searching for something I couldn't name. Everything was normal. And yet, at night, the memory of that grinding, low metal resonance pressed against my skull. One night, I stayed late again, pretending to calibrate cameras. Around 2 a.m., I saw a flash from the bay. Not from the lights, more like the reflection of something curved and black moving across the door. I froze in the control room. The lights in the hangar flickered briefly, then returned to normal. I checked the feed, nothing again. I swear the sound lingered faintly, as if echoing through the walls, but no physical source existed. I started noticing small things outside normal working hours. Loose panels I had tightened days before appeared slightly shifted. Footprints in dust near the hangar, smooth and featureless, gone by morning. The floor temperature felt off, cooler than it should be in the desert night. My coworkers didn't notice or didn't want to. Cameras always failed to capture any anomalies, except that one initial recording. Weeks passed. I stayed cautious, but routine patrols brought me back near Hangar 12 often. Nothing ever happened again, at least not visibly. Yet every time I passed the bay, a sense of weight pressed against the floor and walls, like the hangar itself remembered that night. I couldn't explain it, couldn't prove it, and no one else seemed to see or hear anything. Eventually, I stopped trying to rationalize. I started focusing on my routine, monitoring feeds without thinking too much about what might be there. But sometimes, when the base is quiet and the wind drifts just right across the desert, I can hear it in my head, the grinding metal, low, slow, impossible. Not mechanical, not human, just something that passed through the hangar, leaving no record, but leaving its presence behind in sound alone. I went home that morning like any other, but the feeling followed me. Even now, months later, I notice that hangar when I drive past the perimeter. Lights flicker in my memory, shadows that weren't really there, and that sound, the grinding. Heavy, deliberate, real, and yet impossible. I can't explain it. I can't even fully understand it. I only know what I heard and what my eyes saw, and that's enough to make me keep my distance. I still work at the base. I still pass Hangar 12. I still check the cameras, though I avoid staring too long at the feed from that angle. Some nights, I swear I hear the echo again, faint in my office, as if the metal is still moving somewhere deep inside the building. I've told no one outside my shift. Nobody believes me anyway. But the memory is as real as anything else in my life, and it doesn't fade. Even now, if I walk past that door late at night, I slow down. Listen, the grinding might be waiting. I was working a night patrol at Area 51, driving the perimeter in a beat-up Ford pickup. Name's Jason Keller. It was mid-November, so the desert was cold at night, with frost forming on the dash when I started my shift. The sky was clear that night, stars so sharp they hurt to look at for too long. I was halfway through my usual route, heading along the northeast fence line, when I noticed something unusual in the desert just beyond the wire. 2 points of light, orange-yellow, hovering maybe 4 feet off the ground. At first, I thought they were reflections from a coyote's eyes or a car in the distance, but the highway was miles away. The lights were still, not moving like animals do. I slowed the truck and killed the headlights. The lights didn't change, didn't flicker, didn't move, just stared back at me. I radioed the other patrol units, voice low. Unit 5, northeast perimeter, eyes in the desert, over. There was no response. I tried again. Static. Not unusual for that sector at night, but it made me uneasy. I rolled the truck closer, maybe 50 feet from the fence, trying to get a better look. The lights stayed where they were. I grabbed my binoculars, 2 glowing spheres, no body attached, just floating above the sagebrush and sand. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and looked again. Nothing had changed. I whispered to myself, trying to rationalize it. Could be some experiment from inside the base, some new lights for testing I wasn't briefed on. But nothing in the schedule showed anything outside tonight. I shut the truck off, stepping carefully into the frost-covered sand. My boots sank slightly, making small crunching noises. The lights remained steady. I called out softly, "Hello, anyone out there?" Nothing responded. My breath fogged in front of me. The air smelled dry, like any desert night, but somehow heavier. I inched forward. The lights, eyes really, blinked once, a slow, deliberate blink like they were aware I was there. I froze. The next moment, the lights were gone. Just gone. No movement, no disturbance in the sand, no heat signature, nothing. I scanned with a flashlight, sweeping the area, every clump of sagebrush, the desert floor, completely empty. I cursed under my breath and went back to the truck, thinking maybe I had imagined it. But then my dashboard thermometer dropped fast from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to 12 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of seconds. Frost spread across the windshield, even though the heater had been on a few minutes ago. I shivered, slammed the door, and tried to start the engine. The truck fired up, but the low hum of the heater sounded strange, hollow, almost metallic. I radioed the main gate again, voice slightly shaky. Unit 5, northeast perimeter, lights observed, I'm moving back to checkpoint. Still static. As I drove back slowly, I kept glancing to the desert. The stars above seemed to shimmer more than usual, and I noticed faint outlines, maybe sand dunes, maybe shapes that seemed to shift subtly as I moved. My imagination was running wild, but something about the air felt wrong, like static electricity before a storm, only there was no storm. I got back to the gate around 3:15 a.m. I filed a report with my supervisor, careful not to sound hysterical. He nodded, made a note, then moved on. I noticed he looked uneasy, like he didn't fully want to hear what I'd seen. Nothing official came of it. The next day, I returned to the northeast fence during daylight, walking the area where the lights had appeared. Sagebrush, sand, rocks, completely ordinary. No footprints, no disturbances, nothing that suggested anything had been there. I even scanned the area with a thermal imager, empty. That night, I took the same patrol route again, half expecting to see the lights. Nothing. I tried not to think about it, but the memory kept creeping into my mind whenever I closed my eyes. 2 glowing eyes, unblinking, intelligent in some incomprehensible way. Over the next few weeks, I occasionally checked that stretch of desert when on break or passing by during patrol. Nothing ever appeared again. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been watched. The air along that fence line sometimes felt heavier, and on quiet nights, I could swear I heard the faintest scraping, like something brushing across sand behind the sagebrush. I told a few coworkers, quietly. Most laughed, suggested it was coyotes or light reflections. One older patrolman, though, nodded knowingly. He said he'd seen similar things decades ago, described the same sudden blinking lights disappearing into thin air. He didn't call them anything, just said some nights the desert watches back. I eventually stopped bringing it up. Part of me wonders if it was some classified test or experiment, something they didn't want anyone to see. But the way it moved, the deliberate blinking, the impossibility of the lights simply vanishing, it didn't feel man-made. Even now, years later, whenever I drive past the northeast perimeter after dark, I glance at the desert beyond the fence. Most nights, nothing. But occasionally, in the corner of my eye, I think I see a faint orange glow, perfectly still, just watching. I haven't stopped patrolling or going about my life, but the memory of those eyes is with me, persistent, inexplicable, and quietly unsettling. Some nights, when the wind drifts right, I swear I hear the softest rustle of sand far beyond the fence, exactly where the lights were. And I know, even if nothing is there, I'll be looking, waiting, half expecting those glowing eyes to return. I was on the night crew at Area 51, named Trevor Miles. I'd been doing maintenance for years, mostly moving heavy equipment and prepping the test hangars for whatever flights were scheduled. Nothing really surprising ever happened until one week in late October, when I started noticing things that didn't make any sense. It began with a simple task: moving a stack of crates in Hangar 3. We'd been swapping old tools and equipment around for a deep cleaning operation. I and two other guys, Luis and Hank, spent the better part of the night shifting everything, labeling it, even taking notes so we could put it back in the right spots when the work was done. The crates were metal, heavy, some of them containing test components that were fragile enough you couldn't just toss them around. By the time we finished, everything had been rearranged neatly. I remember double-checking with Luis and Hank, making sure the work order matched our notes. We all agreed. Everything was in order. I clocked out at 6 a.m., feeling like we'd actually accomplished something. The next night, I walked back into Hangar 3 to check some wiring. The crates were exactly where they had been before we moved them. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I'd misremembered. I called Luis over. "Hey man, didn't we move these last night?" He stared at the stack, puzzled. "Yeah, we did. Pretty sure we labeled them all. Why?" Hank came over, arms crossed. "I know we moved them. I took pictures for the log. Everything's in its old spot." We compared the photos. Sure enough, the crates had been shifted in the photos. But standing in the hangar that night, they were back in the exact same positions they'd started in. I mean, perfectly aligned, like nobody had touched them in weeks. We laughed nervously, thinking maybe someone had undone our work as a prank. But the next day, we checked security cameras. Nothing. No one entered the hangar after we left. No strange shadows, no evidence of human interference. After that, it started happening more often. Tools we'd set on benches for maintenance would be gone the next day, only to appear later, exactly where we'd first found them, even if we'd put them somewhere else. Sometimes a wrench would vanish for hours, then reappear perfectly balanced on the edge of a toolbox. One night, I moved a cart of equipment to the middle of the hangar, came back the next day, and it was lined up against the wall again in the original spot. I began keeping notes, trying to track it, dates, times, what was moved, and by whom. But the notes didn't help. Nothing followed a pattern, and no one ever claimed to move the items back. Luis started avoiding the hangar at night, muttering that it's watching. Hank joked at first, then got quiet when I mentioned the tools and crates returning on their own. One night, I was working late by myself, checking the hydraulic systems in the corner of Hangar 3. The air was dry, colder than usual for October, and there was a faint smell like ozone. I could hear the low hum of the building's ventilation, but something felt off. I glanced toward the stack of crates we'd moved a few nights prior. For a moment, it looked wrong, like the shadows around them weren't lining up with the lights overhead. I shook my head and turned back to my work, trying not to think about it. Then I heard a faint scraping sound, metal against concrete, slow, deliberate, coming from the crates. I froze. The sound stopped as quickly as it started. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded hollow in the hangar. No response. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it across the crates. Nothing. No one. But when I stepped closer, I swear I could feel the air just above the crates vibrate slightly, like a pulse. I backed off, deciding I'd leave the rest for the morning. When I came back the next day, everything was exactly as I remembered moving it days ago. Even the small hammer I'd left on top of a crate for a minute, it was back in its original box. After that, I started noticing smaller things. Footprints in the dust where the crates had been moved seemed to vanish if you followed them. A wrench that had been left on a bench had a thin layer of frost around it, even though the hanger wasn't cold enough to freeze anything. Luis refused to work nights with me after that, saying he couldn't deal with the feeling of being watched by the building itself. Hank kept his distance too. I was left alone with the shifting crates, the silent scraping, and the faint ozone smell that came and went like a bad dream. I tried to explain it to our supervisor, carefully, without sounding insane. He nodded slowly and said something vague about procedural checks, then moved on. The official logs? They never recorded any anomalies. No missing time, no unclaimed movements, no unusual readings. Weeks passed, and the hangar became a place I dreaded being in. Even when the lights were on, I'd glance at a tool or crate and think it had moved slightly from where I'd left it a second ago. Once, I left a clipboard on a shelf. I swore I watched it slide a few inches down on its own. When I leaned over to grab it, it didn't move. I eventually stopped trying to figure it out. I started finishing my tasks and leaving as quickly as possible. The building had this oppressive quiet, and the way the objects seemed to have a life of their own made me uneasy. I've never told anyone outside my small crew because it sounds crazy, but it's real. Even now, I check my own garage and workspace at home, and sometimes I feel that same weird feeling of objects shifting back, of air vibrating faintly around certain tools. I tell myself it's my imagination, but I can't shake the memory of those crates, perfectly returning to their original spots in Hangar 3 night after night, with no one touching them. And some nights, when the wind blows just right, I swear I hear the scraping again, soft, deliberate, moving across concrete, just like before. I was on the night radar crew at Area 51, named Derek Harlow. I'd been running the monitors for years, mostly routine flights and occasional test aircraft. Nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what happened one September night when a blip appeared that didn't behave like anything I'd ever tracked. It was around 2:15 a.m., the kind of dead time where the desert outside the base hums softly from its own heat and the wind carries nothing but sand and distant coyotes. I was sitting in the radar room with my coworker Megan, just scanning the usual traffic. A few experimental drones, some light planes, nothing unusual. The screens were calm. Then a small blip popped up off the southern perimeter. At first I thought it was a glitch. Radar had been finicky before, but it didn't disappear. It moved, slowly at first, over the hangars. I swiveled the scope to focus on it. It wasn't moving like a plane. No arcs, no acceleration. Just there. Hovering, almost. I called Megan over. Check this. She squinted at the screen. That's weird. That's not any of our test drones. It's small, fast, and hovering? Yeah, I said. I'm pulling GPS coordinates. I typed in the readout, trying to triangulate its position. That's when it got strange. The coordinates pointed to a spot in the desert, miles outside the base, nowhere near any roads or known landmarks. I stared at it. That's empty desert. Nothing out there. Megan looked from the screen to me, eyebrows raised. So why is it showing up here? I didn't have an answer. I tried switching radar channels, different frequencies. Every time the blip popped up over the same area inside the base. But when we ran the GPS check, it always pointed outside, miles away. It was like the thing was in two places at once, but only on our screens. I called the control tower to see if anyone had visual confirmation. Nothing. Clear skies, no lights. I double-checked cameras on the perimeter. Empty desert, empty hangars, nothing moving. The blip hovered for almost 10 minutes before it started moving again, slowly around the base perimeter. It didn't follow roads or test runways. It made no sound we could pick up on any sensors. I tried zooming the radar resolution to catch shape or size. Nothing. Just a point. Constant, unmoving until it drifted, then back to hovering. By this point, my stomach had that tight, uneasy feeling you get when something's not just unusual, but wrong. I could feel my pulse in my ears. Megan stayed quiet, just watching. Then the blip jumped, literally jumped from one side of the base to the other in a fraction of a second. Too fast for any craft I knew. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Megan nodded, gripping the edge of the console. "Yeah, that's not possible." I tried contacting air traffic control for external confirmation. Nothing. No radar at the regional level picked it up. The coordinates? Still pointing to empty desert miles away. But every time it blinked on our scope, it was back over the base. I started logging everything, timestamps, coordinates, duration, every jump. After a few minutes, I noticed another odd thing. The radar signature wasn't consistent. Sometimes it seemed to shimmer like it was partially invisible. Then it would solidify for a moment, then vanish again. We stayed at the console for hours, tracking it, trying to get eyes on it. No cameras, no towers, nothing. Only the blip moving in ways that defied logic, always returning to hover over the same spot near Hangar 7. At one point, I left the console for a moment to get coffee. When I returned, Megan was pale. "It's closer," she said. "It's right over the hangar." I looked up. Nothing outside the windows. The desert was empty. The wind hadn't changed. No lights, no sound. But on the radar screen, it was hovering right above us. We started wondering if it was a malfunction of some kind, maybe interference with base radar. But the readings were consistent across multiple units. All three primary radar feeds showed the same thing, the blip hovering, blinking across impossible distances, never leaving the base area for more than a fraction of a second. By sunrise, we were exhausted. I called it in to the senior officer on duty. "You saw it?" he asked flatly. I nodded. He frowned. "We'll log it as a transient anomaly. Don't discuss it outside the room." That was it. No investigation, no follow-up. The official log described it as a minor technical glitch. I left that night, driving home through the desert roads. The sky was beginning to lighten, pink and orange over the mountains. The thing I couldn't shake was the memory of that blip, moving instantaneously, impossibly, always returning to hover just over the base. And the coordinates, it always pointed somewhere miles away in empty desert, a place I knew was just sand and rock. Weeks later, I tried checking my logs against FAA records just to see if anything matched. Nothing. No reports. Not even a faint blip from civilian radar. It was like the entire thing only existed on our screens. I've thought about that night constantly. Driving home, walking around the desert near Rachel, staring at the hangars in the heat of the day, I'd feel that same tight unease in my chest. Nothing in my training explains it. Nothing in the base records confirms it. And yet, I remember every jump, every shimmer, every impossible blink back to that spot over Hangar 7. Sometimes I wonder if it was some kind of test, some new craft they didn't want anyone to see. Other times I wonder if it was something else entirely, something we'll never understand. I don't go out to the desert at night anymore. I stick to daylight. The desert looks ordinary then, warm, quiet. But I know what I saw on that radar. I know how it moved. And I know the coordinates were always pointing somewhere impossible, far from the base, empty desert, silent and still. I still check my home flight simulator radar sometimes, late at night. I don't see it there, but I expect I will one day, and I'll know. It's still out there, wherever there really is. I started at Area 51 as a maintenance tech in late August. I'd done odd jobs at smaller installations before, but this was different. Even the roads leading in had a sense of isolation, empty deserts stretching for miles, and checkpoints that felt like they were more about keeping you from noticing things than stopping intruders. My first week was routine, cleaning filters, checking generators, making sure backup systems were online. Nothing unusual. At least, nothing I'd recognize yet. It was my second week when I was called to a section of the base I hadn't seen before. I was told by a supervisor, "Follow me. Don't stray, and don't talk about this." His tone wasn't casual. It was one of those quiet commands that made you feel like questioning wasn't an option. We walked past several hangars, past a series of tall, blank buildings with no signs. I noticed security cameras every few meters, but they didn't seem to be pointed at us as we passed. The desert outside was dark, just faintly lit by floodlights. There was a faint wind carrying sand across the gravel paths. The closer we got, the more I noticed a humming sound. Low, constant like a generator, but different, softer, almost alive. Finally, he stopped at a door I hadn't seen marked on any maps. "Here," he said. "Inside. You'll know what to do." He swiped a card, the door clicked, and it opened. The room was stark, small, maybe 20 by 30 feet, walls painted a flat white, but the lighting was off, too even, too soft, no shadows. Instruments lined the walls, small consoles with blinking lights, readouts I didn't recognize, screens that were dark but glowing faintly with a blue hue. I stepped in, my boots echoing on the floor. The hum grew slightly louder, but it didn't feel mechanical. It was constant, steady, resonant, like the room itself was vibrating. I started running through the checklist my supervisor had left me. I inspected a console, toggled switches, noted readings. The instruments responded, but not like anything I'd seen. Some of them flickered when I moved, as if sensing me. After a few minutes, I realized something. The room didn't match what cameras outside showed. I'd peeked at monitors near the door before entering, and all I'd seen was a blank storage room. No consoles, no lights, nothing, just a bare white room. I blinked, thinking I'd misread it, but when I glanced at the screens again, same thing, empty. I turned back to the room. It hadn't changed. The hum continued. I ran through the checklist again, noticing details I'd missed. Small vents along the floor, pulsing faintly. A panel in the corner that seemed to shimmer, almost like heat waves but colder. A faint scent of metal and ozone that wasn't unpleasant but felt artificial. After about 20 minutes, my supervisor returned. "You're done?" he asked. I nodded, trying not to sound nervous. "Good. Leave the way you came. Don't linger." I followed him back down the corridor, noticing that the hum faded immediately when I stepped out. The desert air outside smelled like dry sage and dust. Later, I checked security footage again. Nothing. The hallway outside showed me walking in, then nothing. No door opening, no shadow on the floor, just an empty hallway. I tried to tell Megan, a coworker, about it the next day. She laughed, thinking I was joking. "There's no lab there, Derek," she said. "We've checked. Nothing. Just storage. You sure you weren't half asleep?" I couldn't argue. I didn't have proof. All I had were my memories, the feeling of the hum, the way the instruments had reacted, and the sense that the room watched me. That first night, I kept tossing and turning. I kept imagining the soft lights flickering on, instruments reading things I couldn't understand, some presence just beyond the edge of perception. A few days later, I was assigned to that section again. I went in, half expecting to see the lab empty, or maybe not exist at all. But the door was there, locked. No card would open it. I called the supervisor. He brushed it off, said it was temporary lockdown. But the hum, the smell of metal and ozone, it stayed with me. I could almost feel it behind the walls, a quiet resonance beneath the base itself. I started noticing other anomalies in that area. Walkways that didn't match the base maps, lights flickering when no one was there. The occasional sense of being watched, like someone or something was tracking my steps in the shadows. I asked other workers. Most shrugged it off. Some claimed they'd seen odd rooms or corridors that weren't on any schematics, but no one seemed willing to describe them in detail. One night, I returned late after a long shift. The desert wind was strong, kicking up sand against the fences. I was alone, walking past that same section. The hum started again, faint but unmistakable. I froze. The door I'd entered before was slightly ajar, just a crack. I shouldn't have looked. I knew I shouldn't, but I stepped closer. Inside, the room appeared as I remembered. Humming instruments, faint lights, shadows that didn't match the angles of the lamps. But this time, I noticed something else. On one console, a readout pulsed irregularly, almost like a heartbeat. I leaned closer. The numbers didn't make sense. Far too small, far too precise, like it was recording something I couldn't see. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how quiet it had become outside. The wind had stopped. The desert was still. The faint resonance of the room felt almost alive. I blinked. The console lights dimmed slightly, as if reacting to me. I felt a cold shiver, a warning I didn't understand. I left, backing away slowly. Outside, the air smelled normal again, the wind returning, carrying dust and desert night. I glanced back once. The door was closed. No hum, no lights, nothing that anyone would recognize. Since then, I avoid that section when I can. But sometimes when I'm working late and the base is quiet, I swear I can hear it. The hum, Faint, almost melodic, behind walls that shouldn't exist. I don't know what it is. I don't know why the instruments respond the way they do. But I remember the room exactly as it was, and I know I saw something no one else is supposed to see. And sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still feel it watching. I was working the night shift as an engineer at Area 51 during the late spring. I'd been brought on mainly for routine maintenance, checking HVAC units, doing inspections, replacing filters, that sort of thing. I wasn't supposed to see anything that wasn't on my schedule, but that never stopped me from wandering, especially when the night was quiet and the base felt almost deserted. It was around 2 a.m., and I was doing a rounds check near the northwest hangars. The desert outside was clear, cool for May, wind light enough to carry a fine dust across the gravel roads. Most of the time, nights were quiet here. Too quiet. But that night, as I walked past one of the older administration buildings, I heard it. Faint voices like someone was whispering from far away. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, the kind of fatigue-induced paranoia you get from being up all night. But the whispers were distinct, carrying through the metal ventilation grates above me. I could make out syllables, but not words. Nothing coherent, just tones, almost musical in their rhythm, but urgent, almost pleading. I crouched and put my ear to the nearest vent. The sound shifted slightly, as if whatever was making it had moved within the ducts. I called out, joking to myself. "Hello? Is someone up there?" My voice echoed down the hall, and the whispers didn't stop. They didn't respond directly, but they didn't fade either. I found the maintenance ladder and climbed into the shaft, thinking maybe someone had gotten locked in or was playing some kind of prank. The air inside was dry, colder than the hall below. I crawled a few feet, checking each segment with my flashlight, shining it into every nook. The metal reflected the beam, making strange shadows, but there was nothing. No one. Nothing at all. I paused, thinking maybe the sound had stopped. It hadn't. The whispers continued, now seeming to come from multiple directions within the vent. But every branch I followed led to empty ducts. I started feeling that same prickling sense of being watched. The way you get when you're sure you're alone, but your instincts scream otherwise. I climbed down, more cautious now, the whispers fading into the background, but never fully leaving. I shook it off and finished my rounds, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But over the next few nights, it happened again. The whispers started in different areas, sometimes over the main control corridor, sometimes near the storage hangars. Always through the vents, never from open spaces. When I checked, the ducts were empty. The base cameras never showed anything unusual either. I started keeping notes. Time, location, duration, patterns didn't make sense. It didn't follow a schedule. One night, I brought a colleague, Carl, along. He was a night tech, not security. He insisted he wouldn't go inside the ducts. We stayed in the corridor, and the whispers began again, soft, echoing off the walls. Carl squinted at me. "Do you hear that?" he asked. I nodded. "Yeah, come on, let's follow it," I said. The sound shifted as we moved, following us, echoing from different directions. But the ducts we passed were all empty. One vent I opened with a wrench, a routine check, and I shone the light inside. Nothing. The metal was clean, undamaged, empty. Yet the whispers continued, now lower, almost like someone breathing just behind me. I spun around. Nothing. The hallways were empty, lights steady, cameras blinking. I started noticing other things. The temperature near these vents would drop suddenly. My breath would fog the air, even though the thermostats were showing 72 degrees. Tools I left on counters would be moved back to exact positions I didn't place them. Once, I swear I saw a shadow move across a wall in the reflection of a polished console, but when I turned, there was nothing. I tried recording audio, video, infrared, everything I could think of. All recordings were clean. No whispers, no shadows, nothing abnormal. It was like the base itself was selectively erasing evidence, or maybe my senses were the only ones being tricked. One night, I was alone again. The whispers started in the east wing, faint at first, rising in volume as I approached. I followed them to a maintenance hatch, opened it, and crawled inside. The duct went straight for a few meters, then split into two branches. I checked each branch. Empty. I climbed back out. The whispers followed me down the hall, keeping pace, just behind me, but with no source I could identify. I stopped, trying to steady my breathing. Hello? I said again, louder this time. The sound reacted. The whispers stuttered, dropped, and then resumed, as if amused or aware I was acknowledging them. I ran to the nearest exit, reaching the outdoor lights of the desert. I glanced back. The vents were silent again, only the faint wind stirring sand. After that, I started taking a different approach. I would ignore the sounds, move quickly past affected areas, never look inside ducts. The whispers would fade when I was near doors leading outside, but sometimes, even walking past a hallway where the vents were blocked, I felt them. A presence, patient, just out of view. I told a few colleagues in passing, but they either laughed or changed the subject. Some of the older staff hinted at similar experiences but warned me not to make a fuss. You start asking too many questions, one said. You start seeing things. Weeks later, I was transferred to day shifts, but the memory lingered. Walking down the base, sometimes the wind would catch the vents just right, and I would hear it again, the faint echo of voices that weren't there, almost calling to me. I'd glance at the grates, half expecting to see something moving. Nothing ever appeared. But the sensation of being followed, of being watched, never fully left. I left the base eventually, got another job far from the desert, but every so often, especially in quiet places, I hear a whisper in the back of my mind, indistinct, urgent, like the desert itself is trying to remind me that some things inside those walls were never meant to be understood. Even now, I sometimes wake in the middle of the night thinking I hear a faint hum or whisper just beyond my window. It's never loud, never clear, but it's enough to make me check every corner of the room, half expecting to find a shadow, a reflection, something moving, just like those vents back in Area 51. I was a contractor at Area 51 back in 2011, mostly doing routine electrical work and maintenance on some of the older hangars out near the northern end of the base. I'd done nights before, but this one was late summer and the heat had dropped enough that the desert didn't feel like it was trying to cook you alive. I had my tools, a small flashlight, and my truck parked just outside the main door of Hangar 7. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened during my day shift, and I was looking forward to finishing the wiring and heading home. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I got the call from my point of contact, a civilian engineer named Carson. He needed me to check some wiring in a section of the hangar that had been decommissioned for years. I didn't think much of it. Old hangars got repurposed all the time. The place smelled like metal and concrete dust, with a faint trace of ozone that I assumed came from the emergency backup generators. I switched on my flashlight and started moving along the main corridor of Hangar 7. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off machinery I didn't recognize, and stacks of crates labeled with codes I wasn't supposed to know. My boots echoed against the concrete floor. That's when I saw it, or thought I did. There was a figure at the far end of the hangar, moving between the rows of crates. It looked humanoid, tall and thin, but the details were fuzzy, like a heat shimmer on asphalt. At first, I figured it was another worker or one of the base security officers doing a patrol. "Hey!" I called out. Nothing. The shape continued moving smoothly, almost gliding. I moved closer, trying to get a better look. My flashlight beam swept over the floor between me and the figure. No footprints. The concrete was bare, the dust undisturbed. That didn't make sense. I stopped, shining the light directly at the shape. For a moment, it seemed to pause, like it had noticed me. Then it moved again, disappearing behind a row of machinery. I turned on my radio. "Carson? Did you or anyone else just walk through the North Bay?" Silence. I tried again, louder. "Hello?" No reply. The radio crackled normally, but the control center didn't respond. My stomach tightened. I walked toward the end of the hangar slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The shape didn't reappear, and there was still no trace of it on the floor. I thought maybe it had been a shadow or a trick of the light, but my flashlight cut through the darkness clearly, and nothing else looked like it could cast that kind of shadow. By then, my nerves were on edge. I moved through the hangar, checking behind machinery and crates. Every step echoed. My own shadow danced across the walls, but there was nothing else, nothing that could account for the shape I'd seen. I reached the area where I was supposed to do the wiring. Everything seemed normal. but the air had a strange quality, almost heavier than usual, like it was pressing against me. I knelt down to check the connections, trying to calm myself. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from the far side of the hangar. Not loud, more like metal sliding slowly across concrete. I froze. My flashlight beam swung in the direction of the sound. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just a crate shifting or an old door settling. I continued working, but every now and then I'd glance up, half expecting to see the shape again. A few minutes later, I did. It was at the far end again, standing between two pieces of machinery. Same tall, thin, humanoid form. I called out once more. Nothing. I tried waving my flashlight. The shape didn't react. Then, as I watched, it moved slightly, then vanished again, leaving the concrete floor entirely bare. No footprints, no dust disturbed. I decided to finish quickly. The wiring was simple, but I couldn't focus. Every sound echoed too sharply. Every shadow seemed alive. I packed up my tools and started toward the exit. As I got closer to the main hangar door, I noticed something else. The temperature felt cooler, despite the summer heat outside. I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. That made no sense. The doors were open to the outside air, but it was dry, warm desert night air. My breath shouldn't have fogged like that. I stepped outside, the desert sky dark with a few scattered stars. My truck was where I'd left it. I glanced back toward the hangar. The doorway was empty. Nothing moved inside. I drove back toward the main base complex, lights dimmed to avoid detection by security cameras. The next day, I asked Carson if anyone else had been in Hangar 7 the night before. Nope, he said. You were the only one. I hesitated, but didn't mention the shape. He'd probably think I was joking, or worse, that I'd lost it. Over the next few nights, I kept seeing strange things, mostly small stuff at first. Shadows that didn't match objects, faint hums of machinery in decommissioned areas, the occasional flicker of light where none should be. I told myself it was fatigue, stress, the desert messing with my mind. Then I saw it again. I was in a different hangar, checking the HVAC system late at night. I caught movement from the corner of my eye, a tall, thin figure moving smoothly across the floor. My flashlight swept over it. Nothing. The floor was clean, no footprints, no dust disturbed. I called out, nothing. After that, I started avoiding those sections of the hangars whenever possible. I worked quickly, never lingering, and I never mentioned the shape to anyone else. I wasn't ready to be laughed at, and I wasn't ready to be reassigned to some new evaluation program. Years later, I still think about that hangar. I don't know what I saw, and I never got a straight answer. The concrete was untouched. Cameras recorded nothing, and the shape didn't leave a trace. But I know what I saw with my own eyes. I can still picture the form, gliding silently between machinery, disappearing without a sound or a mark. Sometimes I drive out near the desert, away from lights and towns, and I swear I catch glimpses of it again, tall, thin, moving just at the edge of my vision. And just like before, when I blink, it's gone. No footprints, no evidence, nothing to prove it was ever there. I came home that night alive and unharmed, but I've never been able to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that hangar. And whatever it wasn't human. I was working as a night security officer at Area 51 in the early 2000s. I didn't expect anything strange. Most nights were uneventful, just long stretches of walking the corridors, checking doors, and keeping an eye on the cameras. But one night changed the way I think about what's real. It was late April, dry and still outside. The desert had cooled after a hot day, and the base lights cast a pale glow over the tarmac. I was stationed in the east wing that night, a long stretch of hallways connecting maintenance areas and storage rooms. My shift started at 10 p.m., and I had just finished my first walkthrough, checking locks and doors, when I got a call over the radio. "Hey, Jensen, you might want to check hallway E3, the control center said. Their voice sounded normal, but there was a hint of tension. I made my way down the hall. Nothing unusual at first. Lights on, doors locked, no movement. But then I noticed something on the security monitor, a guard I didn't recognize walking toward the far end of the corridor. He wasn't in the area we'd scheduled that night. At first, I assumed it was a contractor or someone from maintenance, but I couldn't place him. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the hall in question. The man on the monitor was walking normally, but something about his movements seemed off. Smooth, almost mechanical. I reached the corridor and started calling out, "Hey, who's there?" My voice echoed down the metal hall. No reply. My flashlight beam passed over everything, the walls, doors, vents, but there was nothing. I went back to the monitor. The man was still visible on the screen, moving steadily. I thought maybe it was a recorded clip or a glitch, so I checked the timestamp. Live feed. The timestamp matched real time. Then it happened. Mid-step, just as he was about to reach a junction, he vanished. Gone. No sound, no flicker, no distortion on the monitor. Just nothing. The hallway behind him remained empty. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, trying to rationalize it. Camera glitch. I restarted the feed, still nothing. I called the control center, my voice shaking. "You saw that, right?" The guard, he just disappeared. There was a pause on the line. Then, "We're looking. Stay put, don't leave your post." I stayed there for a while, checking the hallways and cameras. Nothing unusual appeared. No alarms, no motion sensors triggered. The area was empty. I walked the corridor again slowly, shining my light into every corner, vent, and doorway. Everything normal. Over the next few nights, things got stranger. I started noticing subtle anomalies. Hallway lights flickering in patterns that didn't match the electrical system, echoes of footsteps that weren't mine, shadows that didn't correspond to any physical object. Once, I swore I saw the reflection of someone standing in a polished door, but when I turned, no one was there. Other guards began reporting oddities too, but they were hesitant to mention them openly. One veteran, Marcus, told me quietly, "Some parts of this base, they don't behave like the rest. Things appear and disappear. Equipment moves, shadows stretch wrong." He didn't elaborate. A few nights later, I decided to check the E3 hallway again. Nothing on the cameras, nothing on the motion sensors. I walked slowly, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Halfway down, the air felt colder than the rest of the base, almost like walking into an open freezer. My breath fogged instantly, even though the ambient temperature was normal. I paused. That's when I saw it, or thought I did. A faint shimmer in the air at the far end of the hall, like heat waves rising from pavement on a summer road, but cooler. I blinked, and it moved closer, maintaining a vague humanoid shape, featureless. I stumbled back, flashlight shaking, heart hammering. The shimmer reached the midpoint of the hallway, and then, just like the guard on the monitor, it vanished. No sound, no flicker, nothing. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light or exhaustion, but the cold lingered. After that, I started keeping notes. Times, locations, anomalies, footsteps that weren't there. Shadows moving against the light, flickers on the monitors, objects slightly out of place, hallway temperatures dropping inexplicably. I even tried recording video and audio, but all evidence disappeared when I reviewed it. Cameras showed nothing. Microphones picked up only silence. One night, I brought a younger guard, Thomas, along. I wanted someone else to witness the events. As we reached E3, I pointed out the far end of the hallway. "Watch the screen," I said. The live monitor flickered briefly, then a figure appeared. Another guard walking steadily. Thomas leaned in. "Is that another guy on duty?" We watched. The figure moved as if unaware of us, approaching a junction. Then mid-step, gone. Thomas went pale. I saw it," he whispered. After that, I stopped trying to explain it. I stopped calling for help, stopped trying to catch it on camera. The hallway became a place I walked past quickly, avoiding the shimmer at the far end. Eventually, I left the night shifts. Transferred to day work, less isolation, fewer empty corridors. But even now, years later, when I close my eyes, I see that hallway. I can still feel the cold there, see the shimmer, and remember the moment someone, or something, just vanished mid-step, leaving nothing behind. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear soft footsteps behind me. I tell myself it's nothing, that I'm imagining it. But I've learned that some things are real, even when there's no evidence to prove it. And whatever I saw at E3 that night, it's still out there somewhere. The storm had rolled in fast that night, sudden gusts of wind tearing across the desert floor outside the perimeter fence. I'd been working as a night tech at Area 51 for about 6 months, mostly handling maintenance on some of the older research labs near the eastern edge of the base. That evening, I was finishing a late check on Lab C, a section of the facility that handled some of the older decommissioned experiments, not active research, and mostly monitoring and storage. The forecast had warned of isolated storms, but nothing like the one that hit. I arrived around 9 p.m. just as the first heavy clouds were gathering, lightning flashing over the mountains. By 10, the rain was coming down in sheets. I stayed in Lab C, checking humidity sensors and making sure all the air filtration systems were operating correctly. Everything seemed normal, though the sound of water hammering the roof made the place feel smaller than usual, almost claustrophobic. I left the lab around 1:30 a.m., just as the storm slowed to a drizzle. The hallway lights flickered a couple of times, but nothing out of the ordinary. The building was fully sealed, no vents left open, no doors unlocked. I didn't think much of the flickering. The wiring in these older labs was temperamental in storms. The next morning, around 7:15 a.m., I came back to finish the daily systems check. The storm had cleared, leaving the desert dust and sagebrush outside coated in a thin layer of mud. The air smelled of ozone and wet concrete. That's when I noticed it. Lab C wasn't the same. Equipment that had been neatly stowed the night before was now arranged on the floor in precise geometric patterns. Small test tubes were aligned in perfect triangles, their caps facing the same direction. Microcentrifuge tubes formed circles that were almost mathematically exact. Larger pieces of lab machinery, things that were heavy and shouldn't move without multiple people, were shifted by inches into a pattern that repeated across the room. I stepped in cautiously, checking the doors behind me. Locked. Sealed overnight. I checked the security footage. The lab's cameras had recorded nothing between the time I left and my arrival. No storm activity inside, no people entering, no movement at all. The footage was clean, just the storm outside the windows. I called my supervisor, a man named Hendricks, and tried to explain what I was seeing. "Are you sure it's not just how someone organized it last night?" he asked. I told him no, that the lab had been untouched for weeks. Hendricks said he'd send a security team to double check, but for now he wanted me to continue the systems check. I started with the electronic equipment. Nothing was damaged, nothing missing. In fact, everything functioned perfectly, almost as if someone had taken care to not disturb the power supplies or sensors. But the geometric arrangements, they weren't accidental. They were intentional, deliberate, and precise. I measured some of the distances between objects. They matched almost exactly, repeated in patterns across the lab. I can't describe how unsettling that was. Something as ordinary as test tubes sitting in perfect triangles on a wet concrete floor made me feel like I was in the wrong place entirely. Over the next hour, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a maintenance team had come in before the storm, moving things for cleaning or calibrations. I checked logs. None. Security confirmed the doors had remained locked and no one had clearance to enter. The storm had hit hard overnight, but no part of the roof had collapsed and no windows were broken. I even asked one of the chemists, Rebecca, to take a look. She was skeptical, said she didn't see anything unusual at first, but as she stepped closer, her expression changed. She whispered something I didn't catch, something about the precision. She measured a few of the alignments herself and said, "This isn't normal. Even if someone moved them, they'd have to be obsessed to do it this way." I moved to the larger machinery. There was a centrifuge, normally parked flush against the wall, now rotated just enough so its shadow aligned with the arrangement of the test tubes in the morning light. A workbench that had been pushed against the south wall was now set in line with a row of microscopes. I swear it looked like someone had taken the entire lab and laid it out according to some internal map I couldn't see. The strangest part was the air. I could feel it, thick and still, almost static, like it was holding a quiet energy. I couldn't hear the storm, couldn't hear any movement except my own breathing. And yet it felt like the lab was aware of me, like it had shifted to welcome my presence or to mark its territory in some way I didn't understand. I left the lab to get Hendricks and the security team. By the time we returned, less than 20 minutes later, the arrangements had changed again. Not drastically, but enough that the original precision had shifted slightly. Small test tubes were rotated by a few degrees. The machinery hadn't moved much, but some of the shadows fell differently. It wasn't a random movement. It looked deliberate, but we didn't know what had caused it. Hendricks suggested sealing off the lab entirely until further notice. Cameras were rechecked, sensors recalibrated, and the lab logged as a restricted zone for the next week. I stayed back during that time, maintaining systems from a distance, and watched the monitors. Nothing unusual appeared on camera, nothing moved when it shouldn't. Yet, when I went back inside during daylight hours, the arrangements were subtly different each time. Over the next month, I documented everything. Photos, measurements, timestamps. Nothing explained it. The security team never saw anything. The cameras never recorded anything. Objects moved or shifted in ways that shouldn't have been possible, but nothing was ever broken or damaged. I don't know if anyone else ever noticed, or if the lab remained locked and observed after I left. I never found out who or what was responsible. I can't say I felt threatened, but the experience changed how I saw the base. It made the place feel alive, not in a mechanical sense, but as if something unseen was paying attention, rearranging things for reasons I couldn't understand. Even now, years later, whenever I drive past that section of the desert, I can't shake the thought of those perfect triangles and circles, the machinery aligned so precisely, and the quiet sense that I wasn't alone in that lab, even though no one else was ever there. It's one of those things I can't explain, and I don't think I ever will. I was on night patrol near the east perimeter of Area 51 the night the light appeared. I remember the air being unusually still, the desert quiet except for the wind ruffling through the sagebrush. It was around 11:30 p.m., maybe later, when I first noticed it from the ridge. At first I thought it was another weather balloon or a distant helicopter, but the glow was too intense, too consistent. Bright white, almost blinding when I looked directly at it. I radioed in to see if anyone else had picked it up, but the frequency was dead. Static at first, then silence. That was odd, because even with dead spots in the desert, the repeater usually picked me up within a mile. The light hovered over a flat stretch of desert maybe 2 miles from the fence. No movement, no sound, not even the hum of a drone. I called the operations center anyway. Lieutenant Rojas answered after a few rings, and I could tell she was confused. "We're not showing anything on radar," she said. "Are you sure it's not a flare or one of the test lights?" I told her no, that this was stationary, maybe 10 feet off the ground, glowing like it had its own power source. She said to stay on site and keep eyes on it. By midnight, I had the perimeter searchlights aimed at the glow. Flares arced through the air, burning bright before fading to red. I expected the light to react, hover higher, move, but it didn't. It just stayed there, bright and steady, like it was ignoring every attempt to illuminate or scare it off. I tried using my binoculars, night vision, even my handheld camera. Nothing changed. The camera showed a distorted glare. The night vision reflected it as a bright, white wash with no shape I could make out. I noticed then that my watch had skipped a few minutes. I checked again. Still accurate, but it felt off. Around 12:45 a.m., I tried sending video and sensor data back to the operations center. Everything recorded, but when I attempted to review it, the last 2 hours were gone. Nothing. It wasn't corrupted. The files just didn't exist. By 1 a.m., other guards were being called to the ridge. They reported the same thing. A hovering light, unshakable, unflinching, and utterly silent. One of them, a kid named Miller, tried shouting at it, waving his flashlight. The light didn't react. He joked about an alien mothership, but his voice trembled, and I could hear it. There was a tension that wasn't from fear exactly, but unease. Something about it didn't belong to the desert, to the night, or to the base. We tried all the usual protocols. Tracked it with radar, sent UAVs. The radar read a weak blip, barely detectable, but the coordinates kept jumping slightly when cross-referenced. Never more than a few hundred meters, just enough to make targeting or locking impossible. The drones approached and then disappeared. One returned after a few minutes, cameras dead, sensors offline. The other never came back. The light stayed there, hovering. Hours passed. I'd gone through 3 sets of coffee, paced the ridge, and even tried taking cover behind my truck, thinking maybe it would move if I ignored it. It didn't. At around 3:15 a.m., the flare team launched another series of pyrotechnics. Bright reds, greens, even white. The light didn't flicker. It didn't dim. For a moment, I thought maybe the storm clouds in the distance were reflecting it back, but there were no clouds that night. I kept trying to document it. I scribbled notes on a pad, distance estimates, altitude, approximate size, but none of it made sense. The more I wrote, the more certain I became that something was interfering with our electronics. Radios cutting out intermittently, drone cameras freezing, flares going out mid-flight. Then it vanished. No fade, no movement, no sound, just gone. 1 second it was there, the next it wasn't. And that's when I noticed it. All the electronics in the area, watches, radios, the UAV data cards, even my truck's dash camera, had lost the past 2 hours of information. Any log of the event we'd been watching, trying to record, didn't exist. The files were wiped clean. I went back to the operations center to report it. Lieutenant Rojas looked at me, pale, quiet. "We didn't get any data from that area," she said. "All systems show normal operation, nothing unusual." Her voice had that tone you hear when someone doesn't want to lie, but also can't explain something. Driving back to the barracks, the desert looked unchanged. Stars scattered across the sky, moonlight reflecting off the scrub. Nothing suggested anything had been there at all. I kept thinking I'd imagined part of it, but my hands were still shaking, and I knew my watch had been off. In the following days, we checked all equipment, recalibrated sensors, and reviewed security footage. Nothing. The cameras had no visual evidence of anything hovering in the desert. Radar and UAVs hadn't recorded any blips beyond a fleeting moment of static. Everything was blank, erased, or skipped over. Even now, I can't explain it. That light defied all the technology we have to monitor the desert. Hovered for hours, ignoring attempts to illuminate or record it. And when it vanished, all evidence of those hours disappeared too. Sometimes, driving past that ridge late at night, I think I see a glow on the horizon, and I slow down. I want to tell myself it's just a distant aircraft, a reflection, or a trick of the eyes. But I remember weight of those hours, the stillness and the emptiness where my data should have been. I never saw it again, at least not in the same way. But every night I spend on the roads near the base, I keep an eye on the horizon, my heart tight, wondering if somewhere out there the desert is still watching, keeping its secrets, erasing its tracks, and waiting. I started working as a lab technician at a research wing near Area 51 in late summer. My role was straightforward, or at least that's what I thought: cataloging equipment, maintaining machinery, and logging experiment data for the senior scientists. The building itself was off the main compound, almost like an afterthought, low-slung, windowless, concrete walls with a chain-link fence that rattled in the wind. Summers in the Nevada desert are brutal, but that evening it was cooler than usual, with a faint mist hanging over the desert like the air itself was holding its breath. My first week went normally. I learned the basics, logged the readings, and filed paperwork. The lab had this main experiment, always labeled simply as Project Delta. It ran continuously, controlled by machinery I was told never to touch beyond routine checks. The previous techs had passed along thick binders of log entries dating back decades, some from before I was even born. I glanced through them curiously. The entries all followed a strict pattern, same intervals, same outcomes, like clockwork. Then the strange part started. A few days in, I was running a routine inspection of the main machinery. I noticed a panel that hadn't been there the previous day. Or at least I was sure it hadn't. It was small, rectangular, metallic, and seemed to shimmer slightly under the harsh fluorescent lights. I assumed someone had added a sensor or a new piece of equipment. When I swiped my badge and the panel opened, I found internal logs for Project Delta, but with entries that didn't match the machinery currently installed. The readings were from decades ago, yet they were stamped with the current date and time. I shrugged it off. Maybe the system had a bug or a replication error. But over the next few days, the pattern became undeniable. Each time a piece of the machine was dismantled or replaced, the logs continued as if nothing had changed. I asked my supervisor, Dr. Hale, about it. He just waved me off. "The system's automated. It maintains continuity. Don't worry about it." That didn't feel right, but I didn't press. Most people here avoided asking questions that didn't have direct answers. One night, around 11 p.m., I was alone in the lab doing a routine check. The desert wind was sharp outside. rattling the outer fence. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, which I didn't think much of until I noticed the main console's display shifting, logs appearing from periods when the equipment hadn't even existed yet. Panels I'd never seen slid open automatically, revealing mechanisms that didn't match the schematics taped to the walls. I took notes carefully, trying to record what I was seeing. Every attempt to photograph or video the display failed. The camera showed only a static screen. A week later, a senior tech named Roger came in for a late shift. He had been working here for decades. I told him what I'd been seeing, and he paused, staring at the monitors silently. Then he whispered, "You see it too, huh?" I nodded, uneasy. He explained that for as long as he'd been here, Project Delta logs had never stopped, even when every component had been replaced, even after power outages that should have erased everything. It doesn't make sense, he said. It's like the experiment continues itself. I didn't understand what he meant, and neither did he. That night, the lab felt colder than usual. I noticed my breath fogging in front of me, even though the air conditioning was on and the desert heat was fading. There was a low hum through the floors, steady and untraceable. I tried tracing it to the machines, the vents, even the walls, but it didn't match any physical source. Roger suggested I leave, said he'd stay behind, but I insisted on staying. I had to know if the logs were really repeating themselves in real time. By 2 a.m., I realized hours had passed with no awareness. I checked the clock on the wall. Time seemed normal, but the log timestamps had advanced in patterns that mirrored decades-old records. Machines that had been dismantled years ago showed active readings. One console displayed a series of chemical reactions that, according to our current setup, couldn't possibly occur. I felt a creeping sense of unease, like the lab itself was aware of my presence. The next morning, I tried to confirm what I'd seen. The logs matched previous entries exactly, down to the second, but all machinery was back to its standard, updated configuration. I asked other technicians if they had noticed anything odd. Most had no idea what I was talking about. A few glanced at me nervously and changed the subject. When I attempted to replicate the conditions of the previous night, the hum returned, faint and insistent, and the panels shifted slightly, as if trying to remind me that something beyond normal comprehension was happening. I started documenting everything I could. Photos, timestamps, personal notes, everything. But the logs themselves were mercilessly precise. They recorded events that never physically happened, machines that didn't exist, reactions that couldn't occur, all continuing the experiment's decades-long sequence. It wasn't just a glitch. It was as if the experiment had a memory outside of time, independent of the machinery and human oversight. By midweek, my sleep schedule was erratic. I'd wake up in my quarters with notes I didn't remember writing, equipment I didn't recall inspecting. One morning, I found my pen and notebook laid out on the console in perfect alignment, even though I had left them in a pile on the corner of a bench the previous night. The desert outside remained calm, endless stretches of sand and rock under the pale blue sky, but inside the lab, the repetition pressed in on me like a living thing. I approached Dr. Hale again, trying to get a straight answer. His response was unnervingly casual. Project Delta is designed to maintain continuity. That's its purpose. Don't interfere. He didn't explain how or why, and I got the impression that no one here fully understood it. Weeks passed, and the pattern persisted. Each new piece of equipment installed was immediately folded into the experiment's continuous timeline. Logs for reactions that predated the lab's construction appeared, followed the exact protocols of long dismantled machines, and concluded in perfect synchronization with current readings. Even other staff seemed to ignore it, as if acknowledging the anomaly made it worse. One evening after my shift, I walked outside. The desert wind had shifted cooler, and the mountains in the distance were jagged silhouettes against a purple sky. I looked back at the lab and could almost feel the hum through the walls, even from the fenced perimeter. I realized then that the experiment was beyond any human control. The machinery, the logs, the rooms themselves, they were secondary. What mattered was the sequence, the continuity, and it didn't rely on anyone being present. I left the lab that night, feeling the weight of decades pressing down, knowing that the experiment would continue, repeating itself in perfection, no matter who monitored it, no matter what equipment was replaced. My own observations, my own presence, seemed insignificant in the larger pattern, yet the memory of that repetition clung to me. Driving back to the housing complex, the desert stretched quiet and empty on either side, lights from the distant hangars flickering faintly. I glanced at my notebook once more. All my notes made sense, yet didn't match any current machinery. I had watched decades of experiments play out in hours, yet no one else would believe it. I felt the hum in my chest, soft and persistent, as if the desert itself had absorbed the lab's sequence, keeping it alive long after I'd left. I still think about it. Sometimes I wake up and swear I can hear it, faint, repeating endlessly beneath the floors of the desert, and I wonder how long it's been going on, how long it will continue, and whether anyone inside or out will ever notice.